The expression known as the Black Nobility does not appear suddenly in the historical record as a fixed label, but rather evolves through centuries of conflict, social transformation, and ecclesiastical politics. Its meaning has shifted with time, depending on the perspectives of those who used it. In some accounts, it referred to noble families of Italy, particularly those with enduring power within the Papal States, whose fortunes were tied to the survival of Rome itself. In other versions, it became a phrase adopted by critics and later researchers to describe an entrenched aristocracy of merchant families from Venice, Genoa, and other city-states. Families who wielded influence not through open rule, but through the subtler channels of finance, trade, and ecclesiastical authority. Regardless of interpretation, what unites these uses is the recognition that the so-called Black Nobility were neither transient magnates nor provincial landholders, but rather dynasties whose ability to adapt allowed them to span centuries of upheaval, maintaining a grip on institutions that shaped the Western world. The origins of the phrase are best traced to the 19th century, when Italian politics began to define nobility into distinct categories. After the unification of Italy in 1870, the Papal States were absorbed into the Kingdom of Italy, stripping the Pope of his temporal territories. Those noble families who had remained loyal to the papacy, refusing to swear allegiance to the new Italian monarchy, were branded as belonging to the so-called Black Aristocracy, a term chosen both for their clerical allegiance and their opposition to the white nobility aligned with the secular kingdom. Yet to understand the roots of this term more deeply, one must go further back into history, because the families who came to be grouped under this category had already been in existence for centuries. They had already served as protectors, financiers, and manipulators of papal power long before Italian unification provided a convenient political label. The reason such families endured when so many other noble houses fell lies in their ability to bridge the world of feudal landholding with the world of commerce and urban finance. Unlike regional lords whose wealth was tied exclusively to agricultural estates vulnerable to war, plague, and shifting allegiances, the aristocrats later termed the Black Nobility had embedded themselves in the structural heart of Europe's religious and mercantile centres. In Rome, they controlled the sacred offices, the cardinals, and the flow of wealth that surrounded the papal court. In Venice and Genoa, they controlled ships, banks, and the arteries of Mediterranean trade. Their roots reach as far back as the decline of the Western Roman Empire, when ancient senatorial families and new barbarian elites had to find ways to survive under changing regimes. By entwining their destiny with institutions that would endure beyond kingdoms, they guaranteed their survival. It is not accidental that the phrase became heavily associated with Venice. The Venetian patriciate was unique in Europe. Whereas in other regions noble status could be obtained through military service or the possession of land, Venice codified its nobility into a closed caste. After the so-called Serata of 1297, entry into the Venetian Great Council was frozen, and only those families already seated in it were recognised as true nobles. These families became the permanent rulers of the Republic, ensuring that government, commerce, and foreign policy remained in their hands for centuries. Over time, historians would look back and see these same families reappearing generation after generation, adapting their power structures to maintain control regardless of external threats. It was not the transient brilliance of individual rulers that guaranteed Venetian stability, but the collective resilience of these oligarchic clans. Later interpretations of the Black Nobility concept place particular emphasis on these dynasties, identifying their continuity as a defining feature. In Rome, the designation carried slightly different connotations. The families closest to the papacy had long dominated its political life. Houses such as the Orsini, the Colonna, the Borghese, and later the Chigi were not merely aristocrats of land and title, but were deeply embedded in the machinery of the church. They provided popes, cardinals, generals, and financiers. Their palaces stood as monuments to their wealth, but also as nodes of influence within the city. When the papacy faced exile in Avignon, schism, and eventual return, it was these families who provided continuity on the ground, maintaining their estates and consolidating their influence. When the Reformation fractured Christendom and the Counterreformation demanded a new assertion of papal authority, it was again these houses that anchored the Church's worldly position. Their willingness to tie their identity permanently to the papacy, at times serving as its protectors and at times as its rivals, ensured their survival. By the 19th century, when Italian unification brought papal political power to an end, their loyalty to the Pope above the new monarchy earned them the enduring label of Black Nobility. It is worth noting that the word black here carried layered meanings. In part, it was a reference to clerical black, the colour of cassocks and the visual marker of papal authority. In part, it also reflected a sense of secrecy, of opaque dealings, of power exercised in ways hidden from the public eye. Critics of these families accused them of exercising influence behind closed doors, controlling finances and manipulating outcomes in ways that ordinary citizens could not perceive. Thus, the term functioned simultaneously as a political designation and a critique, a label that carried both recognition and suspicion. Over time, especially in modern conspiracy theories, the phrase expanded into a broader category, encompassing not only Italian nobles, but aristocratic families across Europe alleged to control global finance and politics. Whether or not such claims stand to historical scrutiny, they demonstrate the enduring association between the phrase Black Nobility and the idea of an entrenched ruling class that operates beyond democratic accountability. When one examines the origins more closely, it becomes clear that the families categorized under this term rarely relied on military might alone. Instead, their power rested on the control of institutions. In the Middle Ages, this meant direct involvement in the papacy, the monasteries and the legal frameworks of canon law. In the Renaissance, it extended into banking houses, mercantile enterprises and patronage of the arts. In the early modern period, it included secret orders, political marriages, and positions within emergent bureaucratic states. Unlike warrior aristocracies whose relevance faded with the decline of feudal levies, the Black Nobility adapted to each new phase of European history by embedding themselves in the most resilient institutions. By the time revolution swept across Europe in the late 18th and 19th centuries, they had already transformed from feudal lords into aristocrats of finance and influence, able to survive political changes that obliterated other noble lineages. The survival of the term itself is instructive. Unlike labels such as feudal lords or mercantile patricians, the phrase Black Nobility carried an aura of mystery, implying that these families were not simply another ruling class, but a ruling class with unique resilience and hidden influence. This reputation was reinforced by their ability to withstand shocks that destroyed other elites. Empires rose and fell, monarchies were overthrown, parliaments expanded, revolutions declared equality, yet the same family names continued to appear in records of power. To contemporaries, this endurance seemed unnatural, almost conspiratorial, giving rise to the darker interpretations of their identity. One cannot fully grasp the term without considering the close link between nobility and the church. Throughout medieval and Renaissance Europe, noble status was legitimized not only by land, but also by sanctification from religious authority. Families that secured papal blessing or embedded their members in high clerical office gained legitimacy that no secular crown could erase. The Black Nobility, in this sense, were the families that recognized the church as the ultimate guarantor of continuity. When monarchies fell, parliaments rose and new states were forged, the church remained, and by attaching themselves to it, these families ensured that their legacy too would remain intact. As centuries passed, the definition of the Black Nobility broadened. In political usage, especially in Italy, it became fixed to those noble houses that sided with the papacy against the modern Italian state after 1870. In broader cultural usage, it came to signify the enduring aristocracy of Europe who maintained influence across changing epochs. In critical or conspiratorial usage, it expanded into a category for hidden rulers of the modern world. All of these interpretations rest on the same historical roots. Families who adapted across centuries, who embedded themselves in institutions stronger than kingdoms, and who wielded influence in ways that were often opaque to the common observer. From this point forward, the history of the Black Nobility becomes inseparable from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the survival of ancient aristocracies, and the transformation of power through medieval, Renaissance, and modern Europe. To see how the label crystallized into meaning, one must now look beyond the word itself and into the events that forged the environment in which these families rose to prominence, where the legacy of empire gave way to the resilience of aristocratic lineages that never truly disappeared. The dissolution of the Western Roman Empire did not unfold as a single dramatic collapse in one year, but as a drawn-out transformation spread across centuries. Rome's political unity frayed under the pressure of military defeats, economic disruption, and administrative overstretch, until by the late 5th century the empire in the West was little more than a shell of its former self. Yet while emperors were dethroned and legions dispersed, aristocratic families found ways to endure. The Black Nobility, as they would later come to be identified, trace part of their resilience back to this formative moment, when families that had been entwined with the empire's institutions repositioned themselves to survive in a fragmented Europe. In the 4th century, the Roman senatorial aristocracy still controlled vast estates, primarily in Italy, Gaul, and North Africa. Their wealth was built on land worked by tenant farmers and slaves, and their prestige was tied to offices in the imperial administration. As the empire weakened, these same families faced a dilemma: cling to the crumbling imperial structure or adapt to the incoming waves of barbarian federates who were gradually carving out new kingdoms. Many chose adaptation. They recognized that the Gothic, Vandal, Burgundian, and Frankish rulers who seized Roman provinces were not simply destroyers, but potential patrons who needed the cooperation of established elites to govern effectively. In this way, the aristocracy transitioned from serving emperors to serving kings, maintaining their estates and influence even as political authority shifted around them. The fall of the Western Empire is conventionally dated to 476, when the Germanic Foederati commander Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Western emperor. But in truth, imperial authority in the West had been hollowed out long before. The aristocrats of Rome were already operating semi-independently, acting as patrons of local populations, maintaining private militias, and negotiating directly with barbarian leaders. When Odoacer declared himself King of Italy, the senatorial class quickly adapted, providing him with administrators and advisors drawn from their own ranks. This pattern repeated itself with the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, who ruled Italy from 493 to 526. Theodoric recognized the value of Roman administrative traditions and relied heavily on Roman aristocrats, allowing them to retain their estates and privileges. It was during this transitional age that noble families first demonstrated their remarkable ability to survive regime change by attaching themselves to whatever authority structure offered the best guarantee of continuity. One of the key elements of their endurance was the church. By the late Empire, Christianity had become the dominant religion of Rome, and aristocrats had begun to intertwine their fortunes with it. Wealthy families endowed churches, monasteries, and basilicas, converting their secular prestige into spiritual legitimacy. Many aristocratic sons entered the clergy, rising to become bishops and eventually popes. This blending of noble lineage with ecclesiastical office ensured that even when secular authority faltered, their power continued through the spiritual realm. When barbarian kings sought legitimacy in the eyes of their subjects, they turned to the church, which was already populated by members of these ancient families. In this way, aristocrats inserted themselves into the very institutions that would outlast kingdoms and empires alike. The integration of nobility and clergy became particularly evident in Rome itself. The city, stripped of imperial residents after Constantine moved his capital to Constantinople in the 4th century, became increasingly dominated by the papacy. As secular administrators withdrew, the Bishop of Rome assumed greater responsibility for managing civic affairs. Aristocratic families quickly recognized the advantage of placing their members in the papal court. The symbiosis was clear. The church gained the wealth, land, and prestige of the old senatorial houses, while the aristocrats gained spiritual authority and an institution that could endure even the most violent political storms. By the 6th century, when Italy was battered by the wars between Goths and Byzantines, and later by the Lombard invasions, these families remained secure through their dual identity as landowners and clerics. One example of such continuity is found in the powerful gens Anicia, a family that traced its lineage to the highest echelons of the late Roman senatorial aristocracy. Members of the Anici held consular rank in the 4th and 5th centuries, and as imperial power waned, they turned their energies toward the church. Anicius Petronius Probus, for instance, was among the most influential aristocrats of his day, and his descendants became patrons of major ecclesiastical foundations. By the 6th century, the Anici had transformed themselves into one of the foremost noble families of Christian Rome, their fortunes no longer dependent solely on imperial office, but instead secured through ecclesiastical patronage. In many respects, this strategy foreshadowed the path taken by later families of the Black Nobility, who survived by intertwining their identity with enduring institutions rather than transient monarchies. As the Western Empire fragmented, land became the critical basis of power. Vast estates in Italy, Gaul, and Spain provided aristocrats with the resources to maintain private armies, patronize churches, and command loyalty from dependents. These estates survived the collapse of Roman bureaucracy, because barbarian rulers had little choice but to recognize existing land tenure if they hoped to collect taxes and maintain order. In fact, many new rulers cemented their legitimacy by marrying into these aristocratic families, thereby inheriting both land and Roman prestige. This fusion of barbarian vigour with Roman aristocratic continuity created the foundation of medieval nobility. The families that would later be labelled as part of the Black Nobility were heirs to this process, standing at the intersection of collapsing imperial structures and emerging feudal ones. The transformation was not without hardship. The Gothic Wars in the 6th century devastated much of Italy, depopulating cities and destroying agricultural productivity. Yet even in this chaos, certain families survived. They shifted from urban-based political influence to rural control, retreating to fortified villas and monasteries. Their estates became the nuclei of stability in a shattered landscape, offering protection to peasants and serving as centres of local governance. The survival of these estates, often tied to the church, ensured that aristocratic power remained intact, even if diminished in scale. When the Lombards established their kingdom in Italy after 568, they too depended on cooperation with these entrenched elites, who once again adapted to the new order. The Byzantine reconquest of Italy under Justinian in the mid-6th century added another layer of complexity. The Eastern Empire sought to restore Roman authority, but in practice it created a patchwork of control that further entrenched local aristocrats. As Byzantine officials struggled to manage distant territories, aristocratic families positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries. They provided local governance, managed estates, and acted as power brokers between imperial officials and local populations. The resilience of these families during the Byzantine period further solidified the tradition of adaptation that would characterize the Black Nobility for centuries to come. By the early Middle Ages, the aristocracy of Italy and other former Roman provinces had become fully hybrid institutions, heirs of Rome, allies of the Church, and collaborators with barbarian kings. Their survival was not accidental but the result of deliberate strategies. They secured legitimacy through marriage alliances, ensuring continuity of bloodlines across changing regimes. They embedded themselves in the church, guaranteeing spiritual as well as temporal authority. They retained control of land, the one resource that remained indispensable regardless of who held the crown. This triad of strategies, marriage, church, and land, ensured their continuity. The survival of these aristocrats had long-term consequences for European history. When later observers referred to the Black Nobility, they were describing families who could trace their lineages back not merely centuries but millennia, all the way to the twilight of Rome. Their endurance through the fall of the Western Empire set the precedent. In a world where emperors could be dethroned and kingdoms carved up, the aristocracy survived by becoming the constant thread tying past to present. This ability to bridge epochs became their defining trait, allowing them to re-emerge in later centuries as power brokers in Venice, Rome, and beyond. From the ashes of Rome, the groundwork was laid for a new type of aristocratic order, one not dependent on the survival of an empire, but on the perpetuation of family continuity through institutions that endured. The collapse of the Western Empire was not the end of aristocracy, but the moment in which it transformed into something more durable, something capable of withstanding the vicissitudes of history. This transformation carried forward into the Byzantine and Venetian worlds, where the legacy of aristocratic survival would shape the foundations of the later Black Nobility. The survival of aristocratic families after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire naturally directed their attention toward the two great centres of continuity that followed: the Byzantine Empire in the east, and the rising maritime republics of the Italian peninsula, most prominently Venice. Each of these power structures offered different opportunities for aristocratic resilience. Byzantium embodied the formal survival of Roman imperial traditions, complete with emperors, intricate bureaucracies, and an orthodox Christian identity. Venice, on the other hand, represented the adaptation of aristocracy into a mercantile and naval republic, one that would flourish, not by clinging to land, but by controlling sea lanes and trade routes. Between these two poles, noble families discovered ways to entrench their influence for centuries, laying down the pathways that later fed directly into the phenomenon remembered as the Black Nobility. Byzantium was not simply the Eastern Roman Empire in name. It preserved much of Rome's administrative sophistication, legal culture, and urban life at a time when the West had fragmented into feudal kingdoms. Aristocratic families of the West, particularly those of Italy, maintained connections with Constantinople, sometimes through marriage alliances and often through ecclesiastical ties. The Byzantine emperors understood the symbolic value of claiming continuity with ancient Rome, and by extending recognition to noble families in Italy, they could reinforce their legitimacy in territories they still claimed, even if only nominally. For the aristocrats, Byzantine recognition was a badge of prestige, and in certain cases a guarantee of survival, since imperial patronage could protect them against the encroachments of local rulers. During the Gothic Wars, as Justinian's generals sought to restore Italy to imperial control, aristocratic families were indispensable. Their estates and resources served as staging grounds, their knowledge of local conditions guided imperial policy, and their ecclesiastical ties legitimized Byzantine authority. Even after the wars devastated much of the peninsula, the Byzantine foothold in Ravenna allowed Constantinople to maintain influence, and many Italian families found advantage in aligning with the exarchs and governors who ruled in the emperor's name. This created a pattern of dual identity: noble families loyal to local realities, but always keeping one foot in the wider imperial framework of Byzantium. The Byzantine connection also reinforced the centrality of the church in aristocratic survival. The papacy, increasingly asserting independence from Constantinople, nevertheless remained in dialogue with it, and aristocratic families played a central role in bridging the gap. Many of the great Roman noble houses produced popes during this era, men who often had to navigate between Byzantine oversight and local autonomy, Their dual allegiance ensured that their families maintained influence regardless of which authority prevailed. In this way, aristocrats became indispensable intermediaries between East and West, serving both imperial and ecclesiastical masters while consolidating their own power. While Byzantium offered continuity through imperial tradition, Venice offered something entirely new. Born out of the marshes and lagoons at the head of the Adriatic, the Venetian settlement initially seemed peripheral, a refuge for populations fleeing the chaos of the mainland during barbarian invasions. Yet over time, its location proved to be an extraordinary advantage. Situated between the Byzantine East and the Latin West, Venice became the conduit of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. It was here that aristocracy took on a new form, one not tied to rural estates alone but deeply enmeshed in maritime commerce. From the earliest centuries of its existence, Venice maintained close ties with Byzantium. The Byzantine emperors recognized the city's strategic value as a naval ally and granted its merchants privileges in the empire's markets. Venetian families seized this opportunity, establishing trading outposts, supplying the empire with ships, and acting as intermediaries in Mediterranean commerce. This relationship with Byzantium gave them legitimacy, wealth, and the foundations of an oligarchy that would eventually become one of the most enduring aristocratic systems in European history. The Venetian nobility distinguished itself from other Italian elites through its deliberate closure of political power. By the end of the 13th century, the Serata, or closing of the Great Council, ensured that only certain families would have access to the governing institutions of the Republic. Once enshrined, this decision created a hereditary ruling class that could not be easily challenged. These patrician families, bound together by commerce, marriage, and political office, became the very definition of entrenched nobility. Unlike feudal lords elsewhere, their power was not based on land but on collective control of a state apparatus designed to preserve their interests. Venice's rise coincided with the decline of Byzantine authority, yet the two were always intertwined. As Byzantium weakened under the pressure of Islamic expansion, Crusader incursions and internal decay, Venetian families filled the vacuum. The infamous Fourth Crusade of 1204, which culminated in the sack of Constantinople, demonstrated this shift dramatically. Venetian nobles directing Crusader armies effectively seized control of the eastern capital, carving out territories and securing trade privileges that would enrich them for generations. The conquest revealed the true character of Venetian aristocracy: pragmatic, opportunistic, and willing to manipulate even holy war for commercial and political gain. The Byzantine Empire, though diminished after 1204, continued to exert influence until its final fall in 1453. Throughout these centuries, aristocratic families maintained ties with both Venice and Constantinople, ensuring their survival by balancing allegiances. A Colonna or Orsini might serve as a papal commander in Italy, negotiate with Byzantium for recognition, and simultaneously invest in Venetian ventures that linked East and West. This multi-layered identity was crucial to their endurance. They were not confined to one domain of power, but operated across multiple systems, positioning themselves wherever survival and prosperity were most likely. What made Venice particularly significant for the development of the later concept of Black Nobility was its fusion of commerce with aristocracy. In most of Europe, the nobility defined itself against merchants, considering trade beneath the dignity of a noble house. In Venice, the opposite was true. Commerce was not only acceptable, but essential to patrician identity. Wealth from trade-funded palaces patronized churches and sustained the elaborate rituals of republican governance. Over time, this integration of mercantile wealth with noble identity created an aristocracy uniquely suited to survive in the shifting currents of European history. When nation-states rose, when monarchies fell, when revolutions disrupted traditional power, these families, with their experience in commerce, finance, and international networks, were far better positioned to adapt than their purely feudal counterparts. The rise of Genoa, Pisa, and Florence followed a similar trajectory, though none matched Venice in endurance. Genoa produced its own maritime aristocracy, controlling trade routes in the western Mediterranean, while Florence developed a banking nobility epitomised by the Medici. In each case, noble families who tied themselves to commerce achieved a level of resilience that mirrored the Venetian example. Yet Venice remained the archetype, a republic where aristocracy and commerce were inseparable, and where the survival of the nobility was secured by institutional structures designed to preserve their exclusivity. For later generations, when the term Black Nobility was applied retrospectively, Venice stood out as a key model. The idea of a closed caste of noble families, controlling both state and economy for centuries, provided the template for interpreting aristocratic endurance as something shadowy, secretive, and immensely powerful. Venetian oligarchs were not kings, but they exercised king-like influence through their republic, directing wars, treaties, and trade policies that affected the entire Mediterranean world. Their longevity, more than any single conquest or treaty, is what gave them the aura of hidden rulers. Byzantium and Venice thus represented two complementary poles in the story of aristocratic survival. Byzantium embodied the continuity of imperial tradition, allowing noble families to maintain legitimacy by association with the ancient Roman order. Venice embodied the innovation of mercantile aristocracy, showing how nobility could be reinvented through commerce and institutional closure. Between these two worlds, families learned to endure by diversifying their identities, imperial in one context, mercantile in another, clerical in yet another. This ability to operate across multiple spheres was the secret to their survival. The story that begins with Byzantine emperors and Venetian patricians continues into the later Middle Ages, when noble families of Italy deepened their entanglement with the papacy and expanded their influence through the Guelf and Ghibelline conflicts. It is in that turbulent era that the aristocracy, already shaped by centuries of adaptation, would refine the strategies that guaranteed their place at the heart of European power for generations to come. The Venetian patricians represented a phenomenon without parallel in medieval Europe. In most lands, nobility had defined itself through landholding, military service, and feudal obligation. Knights and lords derived their prestige from the number of estates they controlled and the men they could summon to war. Venice inverted this order. Here, nobility fused itself with commerce, and merchant wealth became indistinguishable from aristocratic prestige. This was not an accident of geography, but the product of centuries of deliberate structuring, through which a handful of families consolidated their dominance over the Republic and turned maritime trade into the basis of noble identity. The earlier settlers of the Venetian lagoon were refugees. They came from the mainland during the upheavals of the 5th and 6th centuries, fleeing Hunnic raids, Gothic wars, and Lombard invasions. In the marshes and islands of the Adriatic, they carved out a precarious existence, trading salt, fishing, and serving as intermediaries for Byzantine interests. Unlike feudal lords, who anchored themselves in castles and cultivated land, the Venetians turned to the sea. This orientation toward maritime activity created the environment in which mercantile skill, not landholding, became the foundation of survival. As the settlement grew into a town and then into a republic, the leading families of the lagoon distinguished themselves through their ability to navigate trade routes, negotiate with foreign powers, and command fleets. Over time, these skills crystallized into a hereditary patriciate that transformed merchants into nobles. By the 9th century, Venice was already positioning itself as an intermediary between the Byzantine East and the Carolingian West. Its merchants acted as brokers of luxury goods, carrying silk, spices, and precious metals from Constantinople into Europe, and exporting timber, slaves, and other raw materials in the opposite direction. The wealth that poured into the city enriched certain families disproportionately, for maritime trade required significant capital investment. Ships were costly, voyages dangerous, and profits uncertain. Those who succeeded established fortunes large enough to dominate their peers. In the absence of feudal estates, the ship itself became the nobleman's estate, and the sea his domain. What made Venice distinct from other mercantile cities was the way it codified this reality into political structures. Other Italian towns, such as Pisa or Genoa, also produced powerful merchant dynasties, but their political systems were subject to turbulence, factionalism, and the rise and fall of individual families. Venice, by contrast, perfected the art of oligarchic continuity. The Republic was governed not by kings or transient rulers, but by councils composed of patrician families. The most famous figure was the Doge, elected for life, but even his power was hemmed in by elaborate checks designed to prevent one family from monopolizing control. Behind the ceremonial figure of the Doge, the true authority lay in the Great Council and the Senate, bodies restricted to members of the patriciate. The Serata of 1297, often described as the closing of the Great Council, was the decisive moment in which the patriciate formalized itself as a hereditary caste. Prior to the Serata, access to the council had been more flexible, with wealthy citizens sometimes admitted. Afterward, only families already seated in the council were recognized as legitimate rulers. This effectively froze the nobility, creating a closed circle of dynasties who alone held the right to govern the Republic. New families could rise to wealth through trade, but they could not penetrate the political aristocracy unless through extraordinary service or papal intervention, both of which were rare. The Serata thus transformed the Venetian ruling class into an exclusive oligarchy, where commerce and nobility were inseparable and hereditary. This development had far-reaching consequences. Unlike the feudal aristocracies of Europe, where military prowess and land inheritance determined noble rank, Venetian patricians defined themselves by their participation in commerce and governance. To be noble in Venice meant to share in the collective management of the Republic, to have access to the council chambers where laws were made, treaties negotiated, and fleets commissioned. The family name was the passport into this world, and the exclusion of outsiders ensured that the patriciate preserved its cohesion across centuries. Within this closed caste, wealth and power were not equal. Some families, like the Contarini, Morosini, and Dandolo, achieved prominence through successful trade ventures, military leadership, and service as doges. Others occupied more modest positions, maintaining their status but not achieving the same glory. Yet all shared in the collective prestige of the patriciate, and all guarded their exclusivity with jealousy. Marriage alliances were carefully managed, reinforcing bonds between patrician houses while preventing the dilution of their status. The patrician women of Venice were highly sought after, not only for their dowries but for the prestige of union with a family seated in the Great Council. In this way, the patriciate reproduced itself biologically as well as politically, weaving a dense web of kinship ties that further solidified its hold on the Republic. The economy of Venice underpinned this entire system. Maritime commerce was not simply a source of private profit, but a collective enterprise tied to the Republic itself. The state organised convoys of ships known as the Mude, which sailed at fixed times to fixed destinations, carrying both state cargo and private goods. The profits of these voyages enriched the patriciate while simultaneously reinforcing the power of the state. Venice's wealth was thus institutionalised, ensuring that the aristocracy was bound not only by blood but by economic interdependence. To participate in trade was to reinforce the Republic, and to govern the Republic was to guarantee the prosperity of trade. Patrician power extended far beyond the Adriatic. Venetian merchants established colonies and trading posts throughout the eastern Mediterranean, from Crete and Cyprus to the ports of the Levant. These outposts were managed by patrician families who served as governors, admirals, and financiers. The capture of Constantinople in 1204 gave Venice control over vast swathes of territory, including parts of Greece and the Aegean Islands. Venetian patricians carved out estates abroad, but unlike feudal lords, their estates were not isolated castles, but commercial hubs tied directly to the flows of trade. They were nodes in a maritime network that stretched from the Black Sea to the Atlantic, each reinforcing the collective power of the patriciate. Religion also played its part in cementing patrician dominance. Venice maintained a carefully managed relationship with the papacy, asserting its independence while simultaneously presenting itself as a loyal defender of Christendom. The construction of St. Mark's Basilica, adorned with treasures brought from the East, symbolised the union of commerce, religion and aristocracy. The relics of St. Mark, allegedly stolen from Alexandria by Venetian merchants, provided spiritual legitimacy to the Republic, while the basilica itself stood as a monument to the wealth of its patricians. The Venetian nobility, unlike their Roman counterparts, did not dominate the papacy directly, but they ensured that their commercial and political interests were always aligned with the broader currents of Catholic Christendom. The image of the Venetian patrician was thus a peculiar fusion of merchant and nobleman. He wore the robes of office in the council chamber, but his wealth derived from ships and cargoes. He commissioned works of art and architecture, yet he understood profit margins and maritime risk. He was both aristocrat and capitalist, long before the term existed. This dual identity gave the patriciate extraordinary flexibility, allowing it to endure crises that might have destroyed a purely feudal nobility. When plague decimated the population, when wars threatened the Republic, when rivals challenged Venetian trade, the patriciate endured because its foundations were collective, institutional and mercantile. By the late Middle Ages, observers across Europe recognised the uniqueness of Venice. Whereas kingdoms rose and fell, and cities were torn by factional strife, Venice appeared stable, governed by an aristocracy that had managed to reconcile wealth with continuity. The Republic was often called the Serenissima, the most serene, a reflection of its stability amid the turbulence of medieval politics. This serenity was not the product of harmony, but of the oligarchic mechanisms that ensured the patriciate maintained control. Elections were carefully engineered, dissent suppressed, and rivals excluded. The Venetian nobility, more than any other, embodied the characteristics that would later be associated with the Black Nobility: exclusivity, longevity, and the fusion of wealth with hidden power. The birth of this merchant aristocracy did not end with the Serata. In the centuries that followed, the patriciate deepened its hold on the Republic, refining its mechanisms of governance and expanding its commercial reach. Yet the essence remained the same: a closed caste of families who transformed commerce into nobility, and who preserved their dominance by embedding themselves into the very institutions of the state. This pattern would echo throughout Italy, influencing Genoa, Florence, and Rome, and setting the stage for the broader conflicts of the later Middle Ages, in which aristocratic families, bound to the papacy and to commerce, would wage their struggles for supremacy. The history of the aristocracy in Italy cannot be understood without considering the Papal States, for it was within this unique political and spiritual domain that noble families reached a level of influence unmatched in much of Europe. Unlike Venice, where aristocracy defined itself through commerce and institutional closure, the nobility surrounding the papacy fused their identity with religion itself. The Papal States were not simply a political territory ruled by the Bishop of Rome. They represented the intertwining of sacred authority with temporal power, and aristocratic families who aligned themselves with the papacy acquired a legitimacy that no kingdom could bestow. This duality created an environment in which noble lineages could endure centuries of upheaval, for their fortunes were tied not merely to rulers or cities, but to the Church, the most enduring institution of all. The roots of papal temporal power stretch back to late antiquity. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Bishop of Rome gradually assumed responsibilities that once belonged to imperial governors. He organised defence against barbarian incursions, managed urban resources, and provided leadership in times of famine and plague. By the 6th century, under leaders such as Pope Gregory the Great, the papacy was already exercising authority that extended beyond the purely spiritual. Gregory administered vast church estates, negotiated with barbarian rulers, and even raised troops to defend Rome. These early papal actions established a precedent. The Bishop of Rome was not merely the shepherd of souls, but also the steward of lands, armies, and political influence. Over the following centuries, this temporal dimension expanded. The donation of Pepin in 756, when the Frankish king Pepin the Short granted the Pope territories in central Italy, marked the beginning of the Papal States as a formal political entity. From that point onward, the Pope was not only the head of the Catholic Church, but also a territorial ruler, commanding lands that stretched across central Italy, including Rome itself. This dual role placed the papacy in a position unlike any other institution in Europe. It was simultaneously a spiritual authority that transcended borders and a political authority that competed with kings and emperors. Aristocratic families recognized immediately the opportunities this duality presented. By attaching themselves to the papacy, they could secure positions of immense influence. Some did so by providing military support, others by embedding family members within the church hierarchy. Sons became cardinals, nephews became papal secretaries, cousins served as generals of papal armies. These positions were not merely honorary, they were avenues of power that allowed noble families to shape the policies of the papal court and to direct its resources toward their own interests. Over time, certain families became so intertwined with the papacy that their fortunes rose and fell with its successes and failures. The Orsini and the Colonna are the most prominent examples. These two Roman dynasties, rivals for centuries, dominated the politics of the Papal States throughout the Middle Ages. They built fortified towers in Rome, commanded private armies, and vied for influence within the papal court. Popes alternated between favouring one and suppressing the other, but neither family was ever permanently displaced. Their survival depended on their ability to adapt to shifting papal alliances, but their endurance testified to the structural importance of noble families in the governance of the Papal States. They were not mere subjects of the Pope, they were power brokers without whom the papacy could not function. This intertwining of noble and papal interests produced a unique dynamic. The Pope, as spiritual leader, commanded obedience from across Christendom, yet as temporal ruler, he was dependent on local aristocrats for military and administrative support. Noble families, in turn, legitimized their power by presenting themselves as defenders of the Church. They raised troops in the Pope's name, administered territories on his behalf, and financed campaigns with their wealth. The result was a symbiotic relationship. The papacy provided legitimacy, while the nobility provided the means to exercise it. This relationship endured for centuries, surviving schisms, reforms, and even exiles. The Avignon papacy of the 14th century illustrates both the vulnerability and the resilience of this arrangement. When the papacy relocated to Avignon, Rome was left in turmoil. Noble families filled the power vacuum, ruling the city in the absence of the Pope. The Colonna and Orsini fought bitterly for dominance, while other families such as the Savelli and Catani also vied for power. Yet even during this period of absence, the papacy remained central to their identity. When the popes returned to Rome, these same families reasserted their positions, ensuring that their role in the governance of the Papal States was not diminished. Their fortunes rose and fell with papal favour, but their existence as fixtures of papal politics never disappeared. The intertwining of spiritual and temporal power reached its zenith during the Renaissance. The papacy became a patron of the arts, commissioning grand basilicas, frescoes, and sculptures that symbolized both spiritual authority and temporal magnificence. Noble families took advantage of this patronage system, embedding themselves in the cultural as well as the political life of Rome. The Borghese, Barberini, Farnese, and Chigi emerged as dominant forces during this period, each producing cardinals, papal nephews, and occasionally popes themselves. Their palaces lined the streets of Rome, filled with art that projected both family prestige and papal grandeur. Nepotism, often criticised by reformers, was in reality one of the chief mechanisms by which aristocratic families secured their place in the papal states. Popes appointed nephews and cousins to positions of authority, ensuring that their own families would benefit from papal resources. These appointments created dynasties that outlasted individual papacies, embedding noble lineages in the fabric of church governance. While reformers decried the corruption of such practices, the families themselves recognised them as essential for survival. By securing church offices, they guaranteed wealth, influence, and continuity. The military dimension of papal power also reinforced aristocratic dominance. The papal states were often embroiled in conflicts, whether against the Holy Roman Empire, rival Italian city-states, or rebellious lords within their own territory. Noble families provided the commanders and soldiers for these wars. In return, they received land grants, titles, and privileges. Their military service tied their fortunes to the papacy, but it also ensured that the pope remained dependent on their loyalty. This dependence meant that no pope could ignore the interests of the nobility, regardless of his own reformist or spiritual ambitions. The intertwining of spiritual and temporal power created an aristocracy unlike any other. In France or England, noble families were bound to kings. In Venice, they were bound to commerce. In Rome, they were bound to the papacy. This bond gave them an aura of sanctity, for their power was not merely political but also spiritual. They could claim to defend the faith, to serve the church, and to act as instruments of divine authority. At the same time, it gave them immense leverage, for no pope could govern the papal states without their support. This unique arrangement also explains the survival of these families across centuries. Monarchies could be overthrown, republics destroyed, empires dissolved. But the papacy endured, and by tying themselves to it, aristocratic families guaranteed their continuity. Even when individual popes sought to curtail their power, the structural necessity of noble support meant that their dominance could not be erased. The persistence of names like Orsini, Colonna, and Borghese across the centuries is testimony to this fact. They were not simply noble houses. They were pillars of the papal regime, indispensable to its functioning. The intertwining of spiritual and temporal authority in the papal states thus set the stage for the later concept of the Black Nobility. These were families who survived not by chance, but by embedding themselves in the one institution that outlasted all others. Their power was not always visible, for the Pope stood at the forefront, but their influence was constant, shaping decisions behind the scenes, financing policies, and guiding the Church's temporal strategy. This hidden continuity is what later observers, critical of aristocratic dominance, came to label as black, not in the sense of evil, but in the sense of concealed, enduring, and shadowy. The papal states provided the foundation upon which the endurance of aristocratic families would be built. From this foundation, their influence extended into broader conflicts, such as the long struggles between the Guelfs and the Ghibellines, where noble allegiances to pope or emperor would shape the politics of all Italy. The pattern of survival established in Rome, where nobility and papacy were inseparable, became the model for aristocratic adaptation in wider Europe, ensuring that these families remained at the heart of power for generations. The endurance of noble families in Italy was not merely the story of political manoeuvring or economic adaptation. It was also the story of how they positioned themselves as custodians of the memory and legacy of Rome itself. As the Western Empire crumbled, as foreign rulers came and went, as papal power rose and fluctuated, these families cultivated the image of guardianship over the eternal city. They carried forward the traditions of antiquity into the medieval and Renaissance worlds, ensuring that Rome never ceased to function as the symbolic heart of European civilization. This self-appointed role as protectors of Rome's heritage reinforced their authority, for they were not only aristocrats of land and title, but also living links to the grandeur of the empire, The connection to Rome's legacy was rooted in ancestry. Many of the noble families of the early medieval period traced their lineages, whether accurately or through strategic invention, back to senatorial families of antiquity. The continuity of bloodlines was a powerful claim in a world that revered Roman civilization as the pinnacle of order and authority. Families such as the Colonna and Orsini embedded their genealogies in Roman antiquity, presenting themselves as descendants of ancient patricians. These claims, whether fully verifiable or not, resonated deeply in an age where legitimacy depended on continuity with the past. To present oneself as heir to Rome was to wield a form of authority that no barbarian king or foreign ruler could easily match. The guardianship of Rome's legacy was not only genealogical, but also architectural. Noble families maintained and appropriated the monumental ruins of the ancient city, incorporating them into their own identity. Towers, palaces, and fortifications were often built atop or alongside ancient structures, creating a visible fusion of antiquity and aristocracy. By occupying these sites, the families signalled that they were not simply present in Rome but were its stewards, preserving its monuments and inheriting their symbolic weight. In many cases, they literally carved their residences into the ancient fabric of the city, using the stones of Roman temples and forums to build their own fortresses. The result was a cityscape in which medieval towers rose out of Roman ruins, embodying the continuity of noble power through the ages. This architectural guardianship extended into patronage of the Church. The papacy, eager to assert its connection to Rome's imperial past, often relied on noble families to fund and manage the restoration of basilicas and sacred sites. Aristocrats sponsored chapels, endowed monasteries, and financed religious art that linked Christian Rome with its ancient predecessor. By doing so, they embedded themselves in the spiritual and cultural memory of the city. The great basilicas of Rome, from St. John Lateran to Santa Maria Maggiore, bore the marks of aristocratic patronage, ensuring that noble families were forever associated with the preservation of Rome's spiritual and cultural legacy. The Orsini and Colonna serve again as exemplary cases. Their rivalry, which spanned centuries, was often fought not only with swords and politics, but with symbols of Roman guardianship. Each family controlled key fortresses and monuments within the city, projecting the image that they were the true custodians of Rome. The Orsini held vast estates in the countryside and maintained castles that dominated the approaches to the city, presenting themselves as defenders of Rome against external threats. The Colonna, with their strongholds within the city itself, portrayed themselves as its internal guardians. Their conflicts with each other often took on the character of struggles over who could more convincingly claim to be the protectors of Rome's enduring legacy. This role as guardians also carried a spiritual dimension. Rome was not only the ancient capital of empire, but also the seat of the papacy, the spiritual centre of Christendom. Noble families ensured that their identity was tied to both dimensions. They presented themselves as defenders of the Church, raising troops for papal campaigns, supplying cardinals, and financing religious institutions. Their power was legitimised by their ability to serve as intermediaries between Rome's ancient heritage and its Christian destiny. By claiming to defend both the memory of the empire and the authority of the papacy, they positioned themselves as indispensable pillars of continuity in a city otherwise marked by upheaval. The Renaissance amplified this dynamic. As humanist scholars rediscovered the texts and monuments of antiquity, Rome became the focal point of cultural revival. Noble families, already entrenched as custodians of the city's legacy, seized upon the movement to enhance their prestige. They commissioned works of art and architecture that celebrated both ancient Rome and their own lineages. Palaces were adorned with classical motifs, genealogies were inscribed with Roman references, and libraries were filled with rediscovered manuscripts. In this way, aristocratic patronage became indistinguishable from the preservation and revival of Rome's ancient heritage. The Borghese, Farnese and Barberini exemplify this Renaissance guardianship. Their palaces were not only residences but repositories of antiquities, filled with statues, inscriptions and artifacts that linked their families to the grandeur of Rome. The collection and display of antiquities became a form of aristocratic self-fashioning, a means of proclaiming continuity with the Roman past. Visitors to their palaces were not simply entering noble households, they were stepping into living museums of Rome's legacy, curated by the very families who claimed to inherit it. This guardianship of Rome's legacy also manifested in political symbolism. Noble families often adopted Roman imagery in their heraldry, coins and public displays. Eagles, fasces, laurel wreaths, and other symbols of Roman power were incorporated into their identities, reinforcing the idea that they were heirs to the empire. This symbolic continuity allowed them to project authority not only in Rome but across Europe, where the memory of Rome retained immense prestige. By presenting themselves as living embodiments of Roman tradition, these families secured a form of legitimacy that transcended local politics and resonated with the universal heritage of Western civilization. The endurance of noble families as guardians of Rome's legacy was further reinforced by their role in diplomacy. As representatives of the papacy and as custodians of Rome's symbolic capital, they often acted as intermediaries between the city and foreign powers. Their knowledge of Rome's traditions, their control of its monuments, and their association with its spiritual authority gave them credibility in the eyes of kings and emperors. They were not merely Italian nobles, but representatives of Rome itself, carrying the weight of its history in their dealings. This diplomatic role further embedded them in the fabric of European politics, ensuring their survival and influence across centuries. Their guardianship was not without contestation. The very claim to embody Rome's legacy invited rivalry and suspicion. Families fought bitterly over control of monuments, churches and symbolic spaces within the city. Each sought to outdo the others in displays of Roman continuity, whether through the restoration of an ancient building, the sponsorship of a papal ceremony, or the construction of a grand palace. These rivalries, though destructive in the short term, collectively reinforced the broader narrative of aristocrats as the stewards of Rome. The city's monuments survived not only because of papal patronage, but also because noble families competed to preserve and appropriate them. Over time, this guardianship evolved into something more subtle but no less powerful. By the early modern period, as the papacy reasserted its authority after the turbulence of the Reformation and Counterreformation, noble families presented themselves as defenders not only of Rome's past but of its universal mission. Their identity as guardians expanded beyond monuments and genealogies to include the preservation of Catholic orthodoxy itself. To defend Rome's legacy was now to defend the true faith, and aristocrats tied their fortunes to this mission as firmly as they had once tied them to the ruins of the Forum. The persistence of these families across centuries demonstrates the power of symbolic guardianship. Political regimes shifted, wars raged, and populations changed. Yet the noble families of Rome endured by embedding themselves in the city's timeless legacy. They presented themselves as indispensable to the continuity of Rome, not as rulers who could be overthrown, but as stewards who could not be replaced. Their survival was not only political but cultural and spiritual, anchored in the enduring prestige of Rome itself. The self-conception of these families as guardians of Rome's legacy prepared them for the conflict of the later Middle Ages, particularly the struggles between papal and imperial factions known as the Guelfs and Ghibellines. In those conflicts, the noble families of Rome, already entrenched as custodians of the city's memory, would extend their influence into the broader struggles of Italy, shaping the political destiny of the peninsula while continuing to preserve the identity of Rome as the eternal city. The political life of medieval Italy was dominated for centuries by the great contest between two factions, the Guelfs and the Ghibellines, whose rivalry shaped not only the fate of cities, but the strategies of aristocratic families seeking survival. This was not a fleeting quarrel, but a protracted struggle that spanned generations, intertwining questions of papal and imperial authority with the ambitions of local elites. For noble families tied to the papacy and to Rome's legacy, this conflict became both a danger and an opportunity. By choosing allegiances carefully, by shifting positions when necessary, and by embedding themselves in the structures of both factions, the families who would later be grouped as part of the Black Nobility ensured their endurance through one of the most violent and unstable chapters of Italian history. The origins of the rivalry can be traced to the 12th century, when the authority of the Holy Roman Empire clashed increasingly with that of the papacy. The emperors seeking to assert control over northern and central Italy encountered fierce resistance from the papacy, which refused to recognise imperial domination over the lands it claimed as its own. Out of this confrontation emerged two political camps. The supporters of the papacy became known as the Guelfs, while the supporters of the empire became the Ghibellines. These names, derived from the German words Guelf and Ghibelline, echoed dynastic struggles in Germany, but came to take on new meanings in the Italian context. The Guelfs stood for papal authority, urban autonomy, and often the rising commercial classes of the cities. The Ghibellines, by contrast, stood for imperial prerogatives, aristocratic power, and sometimes the interests of rural magnates. Yet these lines were not rigid. Cities and families shifted allegiances depending on circumstance, and the meaning of the factions varied from place to place. In Florence, the Guelfs were associated with merchants and bankers, while in Siena the Ghibellines found strong support. The labels provided a convenient shorthand for political alignment, but behind them lay complex networks of local rivalries and aristocratic strategies. For noble families in Rome and the Papal States, the Guelf cause was the natural choice. Their fortunes were tied to the papacy, and their legitimacy derived from service to the Church. Aligning with the Guelfs reinforced their role as defenders of Rome's legacy and ensured papal patronage. Families like the Orsini positioned themselves firmly within the Guelf camp, supplying troops and resources for papal wars against imperial supporters. Their castles became bastions of papal authority, their sons cardinals in the papal curia, their daughters married into other Guelph-aligned houses. Through such strategies, they secured their dominance in Roman politics, while simultaneously extending their influence into the broader Italian conflict. Yet allegiance to the Guelf cause did not guarantee security. The Colonna family, rivals of the Orsini, often wavered in their loyalties, sometimes siding with the papacy, sometimes with the empire, depending on which offered greater advantage. This flexibility allowed them to survive when one faction triumphed temporarily over the other. It also ensured that their rivalry with the Orsini remained one of the defining struggles of Roman politics, for each family sought to outmaneuver the other by aligning with the prevailing power. Their conflicts embodied the larger Guelph-Ghibelline struggle in miniature, as battles between papal and imperial supporters played out in the streets and fortresses of Rome. The violence of the conflict cannot be overstated. Across Italy, cities were torn apart by Guelf and Ghibelline factions. Battles raged in Florence, Siena, Bologna, and countless other towns. Families were exiled, their houses destroyed, their lands confiscated, only to return in triumph when the fortunes of war shifted. The shifting tides of the struggle created a landscape of instability, where survival depended on resilience, adaptability, and the ability to forge alliances quickly. For noble families, this environment was dangerous, but also provided openings to expand influence, seize lands, and embed themselves deeper in the structures of power. In Florence, the struggle between Guelfs and Ghibellines became particularly intense, and it provides a vivid example of how aristocratic families adapted to factional politics. The city oscillated between papal and imperial allegiance, each change accompanied by violence and upheaval. When the Guelfs triumphed in the late 13th century, they established institutions that favoured the merchant elite, paving the way for the rise of families like the Medici. But even in Florence, noble houses that had once leaned Ghibelline found ways to reinvent themselves as Guelfs, ensuring their survival in the new order. This pattern of reinvention mirrored the strategies of Roman families, who who adjusted their allegiances without ever relinquishing their aristocratic identity. The papacy itself often deepened the divisions. Popes excommunicated emperors, called crusades against imperial supporters, and poured resources into the Guelf cause. Noble families that aligned themselves with the papacy reaped the benefits of patronage, appointments, and spiritual legitimacy. But papal support could also be fickle. At times, popes made peace with emperors, leaving their Guelf supporters exposed. Families had to navigate these shifting alliances with care, ensuring that their survival did not depend too heavily on a single patron. Those who managed this balancing act endured, while those who failed were often ruined. The Guelf-Ghibelline conflict also reshaped the very structure of aristocracy. In many cities, the repeated exiles and confiscations weakened the traditional nobility, opening the door for new families of merchants and bankers to rise. Yet even these new families adopted the strategies of the old aristocracy, embedding themselves in papal or imperial networks, marrying into noble lineages, and securing ecclesiastical offices. The distinction between old and new nobility blurred, creating a hybrid aristocracy that combined mercantile wealth with traditional titles. In this environment, the concept of a black nobility took root, for it was precisely these families, resilient and adaptive, who managed to preserve their influence across generations of conflict. The role of violence in this survival cannot be ignored. Families maintained private armies, fortified their palaces, and waged war openly in the streets. Rome itself was often a battleground, with Orsini and Colonna forces clashing beneath the very shadow of St. Peter's. The ability to muster armed men was as essential as the ability to negotiate alliances. Yet violence alone was insufficient. Those families that survived longest combined military strength with ecclesiastical influence and financial resources. They could fight, but they could also secure papal appointments, manage estates, and negotiate treaties. This multifaceted strategy distinguished the enduring families from those who disappeared in the chaos. The legacy of the Guelf and Ghibelline struggle was not merely destruction. It also produced new forms of aristocratic identity. Families learned to operate in a world of shifting allegiances, to hedge their bets, and to preserve their lineage even when temporarily exiled or defeated. The constant oscillation between victory and defeat forced them to think in terms of centuries rather than battles. They invested in institutions that would outlast temporary setbacks: the church, monasteries, financial networks, and marriage alliances. In doing so, they laid the foundations for the endurance of aristocracy into the Renaissance and beyond. By the 14th century, the intensity of the Guelf-Ghibelline conflict began to wane, though its legacies persisted in the political alignments of Italian cities. The papacy, weakened by the Avignon exile and the Great Schism, became less able to direct the conflict, while the empire itself fragmented into regional principalities. Yet the aristocratic families who had honed their survival strategies during this long period of struggle were now stronger than ever. They had endured exile, confiscation, and war, yet they remained entrenched in the politics of Rome and Italy. Their survival through this era reinforced their aura of permanence, convincing many contemporaries that they were unshakable fixtures of power. The wars of Guelfs and Ghibellines left Italy fractured, but they also ensured that noble families remained indispensable to its governance. They had proven their ability to adapt, to navigate shifting allegiances, and to preserve their lineages across generations of chaos. This resilience became a defining feature of the Black Nobility, whose influence continued to grow in the centuries that followed, particularly as Venice's oligarchy extended its reach, and as the papacy reasserted its authority in the later Middle Ages. The war for influence had taught the aristocracy how to survive anything, a lesson they carried into the age of commerce and empire. The consolidation of Venice into a true oligarchy was not an event of a single year, but the product of centuries of careful engineering, a gradual narrowing of political participation until only a small circle of patrician families remained at the core. This transformation gave the Venetian Republic its defining character, a state that called itself a republic but was, in practice, ruled by a closed caste. What distinguished Venice from other aristocratic systems was not simply the exclusivity of its ruling elite, but the way it harnessed commerce as the foundation of political power. By monopolizing trade routes, controlling maritime networks, and embedding themselves in the very machinery of the state, the patricians of Venice extended their influence far beyond the lagoon, projecting it across the Mediterranean and into the heart of Europe. The Serata of 1297 stands as the landmark moment in this process, though it was less a sudden revolution than the codification of trends already underway. Prior to the Serata, the Great Council of Venice had been relatively open, with wealthy citizens sometimes admitted alongside hereditary nobles. After the reform, only those families already seated in the council retained the right to participate, effectively closing the political system. Membership was now hereditary, and the list of eligible families became a permanent register of the Venetian nobility. From this point forward, political power was restricted to a self-perpetuating oligarchy, a structure that endured for centuries without serious challenge. The patricians of Venice wielded their power collectively. Unlike monarchies, where a single ruler could dominate, the Venetian system dispersed authority across multiple councils and offices, all restricted to the nobility. The Doge, though a symbol of the Republic, was bound by elaborate checks and balances. His decisions were overseen by councils, his family members barred from succeeding him, and his every move scrutinized by the patriciate. Real power rested in the Senate, the Council of Ten, and other bodies composed exclusively of nobles. This diffusion of authority ensured that no single family could dominate the Republic, but it also entrenched the patriciate as a class. Their unity, reinforced by marriage ties and shared interests, gave them collective permanence, even if individual families rose and fell within the hierarchy. Commerce lay at the heart of this oligarchic order. Venice's economy was built on maritime trade, and the state actively organized and regulated it to maximize profits for the patriciate. The convoys known as mude, sailing at fixed times to fixed destinations, carried goods across the Mediterranean under the protection of the Venetian fleet. These voyages were financed by patrician investors, their cargoes insured by Venetian merchants, and their profits divided among noble shareholders. The system reduced risks, increased efficiency, and ensured that wealth flowed back into the hands of the ruling class. Commerce was thus not a private enterprise, but a collective operation tied to the machinery of the state, reinforcing the oligarchy's grip on both economy and politics. Venetian commerce reached astonishing breadth. From the Black Sea ports of Trebizond and Tana, Venetian merchants brought grain, furs, and slaves. From Alexandria and the Levant came spices, silks, and precious stones. From North Africa came gold, ivory, and exotic goods. Venetian ships carried timber, iron, and textiles from Europe to markets in the east, creating a vast network of exchange. The city itself became a hub where east met west, its markets overflowing with goods from every corner of the known world. The patriciate controlled this flow of commerce, investing in voyages, negotiating treaties, and stationing representatives in foreign ports. Their reach extended as far as Flanders and England, where Venetian merchants traded in wool and cloth, connecting northern Europe to the riches of the Mediterranean. The strength of Venetian commerce lay not only in the goods it transported, but in the institutions that managed it. The state provided legal frameworks for contracts, standardized weights and measures, and regulated markets to ensure fairness among investors. The Venetian currency, particularly the gold ducat, became one of the most trusted coins in Europe, a symbol of the Republic's stability and wealth. Behind these institutions stood the patricians, whose collective control guaranteed continuity. Unlike other merchant cities where factionalism often disrupted trade, Venice maintained remarkable stability, allowing its commercial networks to flourish. The oligarchy's control extended beyond trade into colonial possessions. Venetian patricians administered overseas territories such as Crete, Cyprus, and numerous Aegean islands, transforming them into nodes of the commercial empire. These colonies provided resources, strategic naval bases, and markets for Venetian goods. Governed by nobles appointed from Venice, they reinforced the patriciate's dominance by extending its reach across the Mediterranean. The colonial empire was not vast compared to the later empires of Spain or Britain, but it was deeply integrated into the Republic's economic system, serving the interests of the patrician class. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 had already demonstrated the oligarchy's ability to manipulate events on a grand scale. By diverting crusaders to Constantinople, Venice secured enormous commercial privileges and territorial gains. Patrician families enriched themselves through the spoils of conquest, seizing valuable trading posts and establishing a near monopoly on Eastern commerce. The Crusade revealed the true character of the Venetian oligarchy: pragmatic, opportunistic, and willing to subvert even holy causes in the pursuit of profit. From that point onward, Venice became synonymous with commercial cunning, its patricians seen as masters of manipulation who pulled the strings of politics to serve their mercantile interests. The oligarchy's long arm of commerce also extended into finance. Venetian banks became central to European trade, providing credit, facilitating transfers and ensuring voyages. The patricians themselves were often financiers as well as merchants, reinvesting profits into banking enterprises that further expanded their influence. This financial power allowed them to shape the economies of other states, for kings and princes often depended on Venetian credit to fund wars and projects. In this sense, the patriciate was not confined to the lagoon or the Mediterranean, but projected influence deep into the political life of Europe. Venice's role as a financial and commercial hub gave its oligarchy a reputation that endured for centuries. Admirers saw the Republic as a model of stability, prosperity, and rational governance. Critics accused it of secrecy, manipulation, and greed. Both perspectives captured elements of the truth. The patriciate operated behind closed doors, conducting politics in a manner opaque to outsiders, and their collective control over commerce gave them immense, sometimes invisible leverage. This combination of exclusivity, secrecy, and longevity contributed to the later perception of Venice as a core component of the Black Nobility. The endurance of the oligarchy was reinforced by its ability to adapt. When the Ottoman Empire rose in the 15th century and seized control of key Eastern markets, Venice shifted its focus to new routes, seeking opportunities in the West. When Portuguese explorers opened the sea route around Africa, threatening Venice's spice trade, the patriciate diversified its investments, turning to banking, manufacturing, and other enterprises. Even as the balance of global trade shifted, the Venetian oligarchy maintained its relevance by adapting to new conditions. This adaptability, rooted in their collective institutions, distinguished them from less resilient aristocracies elsewhere in Europe. The long arm of commerce extended into culture as well. The wealth generated by trade funded magnificent palaces, churches, and works of art that adorn the city. Patrician families commissioned architects, painters, and sculptors, turning Venice into a cultural capital that rivaled Florence and Rome. The grandeur of Venetian art and architecture was not merely decorative, it was a projection of oligarchic power. The Doge's Palace, the Basilica of St. Mark, and the Rialto were symbols of a republic whose nobility had transformed commerce into enduring prestige. Visitors to the city marvelled not only at its beauty, but at the sense of order and permanence projected by its ruling elite. The Venetian model influenced other aristocratic systems, but none replicated it fully. Genoa produced its own mercantile oligarchy, but factional rivalries undermined its stability. Florence developed a banking aristocracy, but it was subject to the dominance of individual families like the Medici. Only Venice managed to sustain a collective patriciate across centuries, preserving both exclusivity and continuity. This unique system became a reference point for later conceptions of hidden aristocratic power, for it embodied the qualities of secrecy, resilience, and commercial dominance that came to define the idea of the Black Nobility. By the early modern period, the Venetian oligarchy had already established itself as one of the most enduring ruling classes in history. Its reach extended across the Mediterranean, into Europe's financial networks, and into the cultural memory of the continent. Its power was not flashy or ostentatious, but steady, institutional, and deeply rooted in commerce. This combination of subtlety and permanence gave it an aura of mystery, feeding the perception that Venetian patricians were not merely merchants or nobles, but hidden rulers whose influence extended far beyond the visible structures of power. The legacy of the Venetian oligarchy would persist even as the balance of power shifted toward nation-states and empires. The strategies honed in Venice, exclusivity, adaptability, and the fusion of commerce with aristocracy, provided the model for noble families across Europe. Their survival through the turbulence of the late medieval period prepared them for the new age of banking, diplomacy, and empire. The long arm of commerce that stretched from the lagoon into the Mediterranean would soon intertwine with the broader networks of Italy's noble houses, particularly those of Rome and Florence, setting the stage for the web of dynastic alliances that defined the later Renaissance. If Venice represented the perfection of an oligarchic republic rooted in maritime commerce, Genoa and Florence offered alternative models of aristocratic endurance, equally marked by rivalry, adaptability, and the intertwining of wealth with political power. These cities produced their own noble houses, families who played decisive roles in shaping the trajectory of Italy, and in many ways Europe itself. Their struggles, alliances, and rivalries not only mirrored the Venetian example, but also extended the reach of aristocracy into banking, trade, and the fabric of civic life. To understand the resilience of Italy's nobility, one must consider how Genoa and Florence nurtured their own elites, how these families competed with one another, and how their strategies of survival ensured their place in the story later framed under the term Black Nobility. Genoa, like Venice, was a maritime republic, born from the natural advantages of its coastal position. Its families built their fortunes on trade, shipbuilding, and naval warfare. From the 11th century onward, Genoese merchants expanded across the Mediterranean, establishing colonies, trading posts, and financial networks that rivaled those of Venice. They played central roles in the Crusades, transporting pilgrims and supplies to the Holy Land, and they secured privileges in eastern markets through both diplomacy and conquest. Unlike Venice, however, Genoa was plagued by chronic factionalism. Its noble families were divided into competing clans, often aligned with either the Guelfs or the Ghibellines, and their rivalries frequently erupted into open conflict. The Spinola, Doria, Fieschi, and Grimaldi were among the most prominent of Genoa's noble houses. Each commanded fleets, held territories, and controlled factions within the city. Their power was immense, but it was also precarious, for Genoa's political system lacked the stability of Venice's Serata. Offices shifted hands as factions triumphed or fell, and noble families rose and fell with dizzying speed. Yet despite the instability, these houses endured, adapting to each turn of fortune by leveraging their naval power and financial resources. The Dorias, in particular, exemplify this resilience. Andrea Doria, the great admiral of the 16th century, transformed Genoa into a client state of Spain, securing privileges for his family while ensuring the survival of the Republic under Habsburg protection. His career demonstrated the ability of Genoese nobility to pivot from factional strife to international diplomacy, preserving their influence by attaching themselves to larger powers. The chronic instability of Genoa did not prevent its nobles from extending their influence abroad. Genoese bankers became indispensable to European monarchs, particularly the Spanish crown, which relied heavily on their credit to fund wars and empire. The Casa di San Giorgio, a powerful financial institution controlled by Genoese elites, managed public debt with remarkable efficiency, demonstrating the city's capacity for institutional innovation even amid political turmoil. Genoese merchants and bankers established themselves in Seville, Madrid, and Naples, embedding their families in the financial arteries of European empire. In this way, Genoa's nobility projected influence far beyond the Ligurian coast, their fortunes tied to the rise and fall of global powers. Florence, by contrast, was not a maritime republic, but a city whose wealth was rooted in textiles, banking, and cultural patronage. From the 12th century onward, Florence developed into a thriving commune, its guilds and merchants dominating civic life. Yet behind the institutions of communal government stood powerful families whose rivalries shaped the destiny of the city. Florence was notorious for its internal conflicts, with noble houses aligning themselves as Guelfs or Ghibellines, waging war in the streets and seeking to dominate the Republic through both wealth and violence. The Medici, of course, became the most famous of Florence's families, but their rise came after centuries of aristocratic competition. Earlier families such as the Albizzi, Strozzi, Pazzi and Bardi had dominated Florentine politics, often using their banking fortunes to secure power. The Bardi and Peruzzi, for example, became the great bankers of Europe in the 14th century, financing kings and popes alike. Their collapse after the defaults of Edward III of England demonstrated both the risks and the scale of Florentine banking. Yet even when individual families fell, others rose to take their place, ensuring that Florence's aristocracy as a whole remained resilient. What distinguished Florence was the fusion of financial power with cultural influence. Florentine nobles not only controlled banks and guilds, but also sponsored art, literature and architecture that transformed the city into a beacon of the Renaissance. The Medici epitomized this transformation, using their wealth to patronize figures such as Brunelleschi, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci. Their palaces, chapels, and libraries projected an image of cultural guardianship that rivaled the claims of Roman nobles to be protectors of antiquity. In Florence, to be a noble was not only to command wealth, but also to shape the very identity of Western culture. The rivalries of Florence were as fierce as those of Genoa. The Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, in which the Pazzi family attempted to overthrow the Medici during a church service, illustrates the intensity of Florentine aristocratic competition. The plot failed, and the Pazzi were brutally suppressed. But the episode revealed how high the stakes had become in a city where wealth, politics and culture were so tightly interwoven. Families gambled everything for dominance, yet even those who lost often managed to survive by retreating into exile, marrying into other houses, or shifting their financial operations abroad. Survival, not victory, was the true measure of resilience. The interplay between Genoa and Florence also shaped the broader politics of Italy. Genoese bankers financed Florentine enterprises, while Florentine merchants established ties with Genoese networks. Rivalries within each city mirrored larger struggles between papal and imperial forces, and noble families often played roles in multiple arenas at once. A Florentine banker might serve as financier to the papacy, while a Genoese admiral aligned with the empire, yet both were tied together through the flows of credit and commerce. This web of connections reinforced the endurance of the aristocracy, for their fortunes were never confined to a single city but spread across Italy and Europe. It is in this context that the idea of the Black Nobility gains resonance. The resilience of noble families in Genoa and Florence was not the result of chance, but of strategies honed through centuries of conflict and adaptation. They survived factional wars, financial collapses, conspiracies, and foreign domination by embedding themselves in enduring institutions, commerce, banking, and culture. They presented themselves not only as rulers of cities, but as indispensable intermediaries in the larger European order. Their endurance through constant upheaval gave them the aura of permanence, the sense that they were fixtures of power that no revolution or invasion could dislodge. The stories of Genoa and Florence thus complement that of Venice. Each city produced its own form of aristocracy, rooted in different foundations but united by resilience. In Venice, the oligarchy fused nobility with maritime commerce. In Genoa, noble houses survived factionalism by leveraging naval power and international finance. In Florence, families transformed banking and cultural patronage into instruments of dominance. Together, they demonstrated the extraordinary adaptability of Italian aristocracy, an adaptability that allowed them to weather centuries of war, plague, and political upheaval while maintaining their grip on influence. The rival noble houses of Italy did not merely compete within their cities, they also competed across the peninsula, forging alliances, waging wars, and shaping the destiny of states. Their rivalries set the stage for the broader web of dynastic marriages and alliances that would define the late medieval and Renaissance worlds. It was through these strategies that the aristocracy ensured its survival into the modern age, where the legacy of families like the Medici, Doria, and Grimaldi continued to shape politics, finance, and culture long after the medieval struggles had passed. The endurance of noble families in Italy and across Europe was never guaranteed by military power or wealth alone. Wars could be lost, fortunes could collapse, cities could change hands. What ensured continuity above all was the careful weaving of dynastic networks through marriage alliances. This web of connections bound families together across generations, linking their fates in ways that transcended temporary setbacks. Marriage was the single most effective tool of aristocratic survival, for it turned rivals into kin, secured access to new resources, and created a fabric of continuity that endured when politics and fortune shifted. For the families later grouped under the concept of the Black Nobility, marriage alliances were not simply personal unions but deliberate strategies of long-term preservation. In medieval and Renaissance Italy, the importance of marriage as a political instrument cannot be overstated. Families measured their prestige not only by the wealth they controlled, but by the alliances their marriages secured. A daughter's dowry could open the doors of another city, cement peace after a feud, or link a family to the papal court. A son's marriage could bring new estates, a claim to a title, or entry into foreign markets. Each union was calculated, weighed, and negotiated with the precision of diplomacy. Love, if it appeared at all, was secondary to the arithmetic of survival. The Roman nobility, deeply tied to the papacy, used marriage to expand their influence beyond the city. The Colonna, for instance, arranged unions that tied them to Neapolitan and Spanish aristocracy, ensuring their survival even when papal politics turned against them. The Orsini did the same, weaving their lineages into the fabric of central and southern Italy. By marrying into other noble houses, they guaranteed allies in times of conflict and access to resources outside Rome. These marriages also reinforced their claims as guardians of Rome's legacy, for by spreading their lineage across Italy, they presented themselves as the natural connectors of the peninsula's aristocracy. In Florence, the Medici perfected the art of dynastic marriage. Rising from the world of banking into the heights of aristocracy, the Medici used marriage alliances to secure legitimacy among older noble families. Their unions linked them to the Orsini, the Sforza of Milan, and eventually to European royalty itself. Catherine de' Medici's marriage to Henry II of France in 1533 elevated the family to the highest level of continental power, embedding them in the politics of a great monarchy. This single alliance transformed the Medici from Florentine bankers into dynasts, whose influence shaped the fate of France for generations. Through Catherine's children, the Medici bloodline intertwined with the royal house of Valois, demonstrating how one calculated marriage could alter the destiny of a family and extend its influence across Europe. The Sforza of Milan provide another striking example. Originally condottieri, mercenary captains who rose to power through military prowess, the Sforza legitimized their rule through strategic marriages. Francesco Sforza married Bianca Maria Visconti, the daughter of the last Duke of Milan from the ruling Visconti dynasty. Through this marriage, the Sforza transformed themselves from soldiers of fortune into the legitimate rulers of Milan, inheriting the prestige and continuity of the Visconti line. This pattern was repeated across Italy. Marriages fused new wealth or military power with old legitimacy, creating families that combined adaptability with continuity. Dowries were central to this system. A daughter's marriage was not only a union of bloodlines, but also an economic transaction. Noble families invested enormous resources in dowries, sometimes bankrupting themselves to secure advantageous matches. These dowries could include cash, land, or political favours, and they served as the glue that bound alliances together. The size of a dowry signalled the wealth and status of a family, while the match it secured determined its political trajectory. For families tied to the papacy, dowries could even include the promise of a cardinal's hat or an ecclesiastical office, further intertwining spiritual and temporal power. Marriage alliances were also essential in navigating the turbulent factionalism of Italy. When Guelphs and Ghibellines tore cities apart, marriages often provided the only stable bridges between factions. A Guelph daughter married to a Ghibelline's son could create a truce, however temporary, and prevent total destruction. Families used these unions to hedge their bets, ensuring survival regardless of which faction triumphed. The constant shifting of allegiances in Italian politics made such strategies indispensable, for they allowed families to survive defeats that might otherwise have been fatal. Beyond Italy, marriage connected the Black Nobility to the broader European aristocracy. Venetian patricians, though usually marrying within their own caste to preserve exclusivity, occasionally formed unions with foreign elites to expand their networks. Genoese nobles married into Spanish and French houses, leveraging their role as bankers to secure prestigious alliances. Florentine families, enriched by banking, married into northern courts, bringing their wealth into the service of kings and dukes. These marriages extended the influence of Italian nobility far beyond the peninsula, embedding them in the politics of Europe and ensuring that their survival was tied to the survival of multiple regimes at once. The dynastic web created by these marriages was remarkably resilient. Even when one family was exiled or defeated, its alliances provided it with havens, resources, and patrons abroad. An exiled noble might take refuge with in-laws in another city, maintain financial support through dowry connections, or secure ecclesiastical positions through kinship ties. This network ensured that aristocratic families were never isolated, but always embedded in a wider web of continuity. It also meant that revolutions or invasions rarely eliminated entire lineages, for their survival was guaranteed by their kin in other regions. The cultural significance of marriage alliances cannot be overlooked. They were celebrated with pageantry, recorded in genealogies, and immortalized in art. Portraits of brides and grooms adorned palaces, emphasizing the union of houses and the continuity of bloodlines. Family trees were meticulously maintained, tracing connections across centuries and continents. These genealogies were not merely records but tools of power, used to assert claims, justify inheritances, and demonstrate legitimacy. To present a lineage stretching back to antiquity or tied to multiple royal houses was to command authority that no temporary setback could erase. Marriage alliances also played a role in the survival of noble families during times of crisis. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, wiping out populations and destabilizing economies, noble families used marriage to consolidate their survival. Widows remarried quickly to preserve alliances, orphans were married off to secure guardianship, and families struck deals to merge estates. The demographic devastation of the plague, which might have shattered the nobility, was mitigated by the resilience of dynastic strategies. Through marriage, families ensured that their names, lands, and influence continued despite the catastrophic loss of life. Over the centuries, the cumulative effect of these marriages was the creation of a vast interconnected web of aristocracy that spanned Italy and Europe. The Black Nobility, as they came to be identified, were not isolated dynasties but nodes in this larger network. Their resilience derived not only from their individual strategies, but from the collective continuity of the aristocratic web. Each marriage added another thread, reinforcing the structure and ensuring that no single defeat could unravel it. The endurance of these families was, in many ways, the endurance of the network itself. The web of dynastic continuity also had profound implications for European politics. Through marriages, noble families influenced the succession of thrones, the inheritance of territories, and the alliances of kingdoms. Wars were fought not only with armies but with genealogies, as rival claims to crowns and lands were justified through marriage ties. Italian families played their part in these struggles, embedding themselves in dynastic disputes across Europe. The Medici in France, the Doria in Spain, the Colonna in Naples, each used marriage to expand their influence beyond their home cities, shaping the fate of nations through the ties of blood. This dynastic web gave the aristocracy an aura of permanence that fed directly into the later perception of the Black Nobility. To outsiders, it seemed that the same families always reappeared, always connected, always enduring despite wars, revolutions, and upheavals. The explanation lay in marriage. By weaving themselves into the fabric of Europe, these families ensured that their legacy was never confined to a single city or regime. They became part of a structure that transcended politics, a structure that could adapt, survive, and re-emerge no matter how the surface of history changed. The resilience of marriage alliances prepared noble families for the transformations of the Renaissance and the early modern period, when banking, commerce, and centralized states reshaped Europe. Their dynastic strategies ensured that they remained relevant even as the forms of power evolved. From this foundation, they extended their influence into the world of finance and usury, embedding themselves in the very structures of wealth that would define the coming age. The endurance of noble families through the medieval and Renaissance periods cannot be separated from the rise of banking and the power of finance. While land and marriage secured continuity in earlier centuries, by the High Middle Ages and beyond it was control of credit, lending and monetary circulation that determined who could shape the destinies of cities, kingdoms, and even the papacy itself. The noble families of Italy, particularly those intertwined with the papal court and the great mercantile republics, learned to navigate this new landscape of finance, often operating in the shadows of moral debate and ecclesiastical law. For though the Church officially condemned usury, in practice it could not function without credit, and the families who mastered the art of lending became indispensable to the very institution that publicly denounced them. This paradox lies at the heart of the hidden power of finance, and it became one of the chief reasons why the families associated with the Black Nobility were able to outlast empires, monarchies, and revolutions. The condemnation of usury was rooted in Christian doctrine. To charge interest on a loan was seen as profiting from time itself, which belonged to God. Theologians from Augustine to Aquinas reiterated the prohibition, and councils of the Church codified it in canon law. Yet commerce demanded credit. Merchants needed loans to finance voyages, kings needed funds to wage wars, and even the papacy required credit to administer its vast bureaucracy. This contradiction created a space in which noble families could operate, for while they could not openly charge interest, they devised ingenious methods to disguise it. Contracts were written in the language of partnership, fees were hidden in exchange rates, and financial instruments were invented that skirted the letter of the law while violating its spirit. Florence became the laboratory of this financial innovation. Its great banking houses such as the Bardi, Peruzzi, and later the Medici perfected systems of international finance that linked markets from London to Constantinople. They developed bills of exchange, which allowed merchants to transfer funds without carrying large amounts of coin. They created networks of branches that could settle debts across borders, effectively inventing the modern bank. Behind these innovations stood noble families, whose fortunes rested not only on trade but on the ability to extend credit. Their power derived not from the visible spectacle of armies or palaces, but from the invisible leverage of debt, which bound kings, popes and merchants alike to their interests. The collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi in the 14th century, triggered by Edward III of England's default on massive loans, revealed both the risks and the scale of Florentine banking. These houses had lent sums so vast that their failure destabilised the entire city. Yet even in collapse, the pattern of aristocratic finance endured. New families rose to take their place, learning from their mistakes and refining their methods. The Medici, in particular, absorbed these lessons, building a banking empire that combined financial acumen with political cunning. By embedding themselves in the papacy, securing papal accounts, and placing family members in key ecclesiastical offices, they turned banking into an instrument of dynastic survival. Rome, too, became a centre of financial power. The papal court required constant credit to fund its operations, from building projects to military campaigns. Noble families who provided this credit secured enormous influence. They disguised interest as fees for services or as fluctuations in currency exchange, allowing them to profit while maintaining the appearance of legality. The Colonna and Orsini, among others, became as much financiers as warriors. Their survival ensured not only by castles and troops, but by ledgers and contracts. To finance the papacy was to hold it in one's debt, and this leverage often mattered more than formal titles or offices. Venice and Genoa offered yet another model. Their patrician families integrated finance directly into the state. The Casa di San Giorgio in Genoa became a model of public-private partnership, managing the Republic's debt with extraordinary efficiency. Venetian banks and insurers, meanwhile, turned maritime trade into a system of collective investment, spreading risks and profits across the patriciate. In both cities, finance was inseparable from governance, and the families who controlled it became indispensable to the survival of the republics themselves. This integration of finance into the fabric of the state ensured that the ruling families could not be displaced without collapsing the system, giving them a permanence that other aristocracies could only envy. The hidden power of finance lay in its invisibility. Soldiers and fortresses could be seen, but debt was intangible, its effects felt only in the dependence it created. A king indebted to a banker was bound by obligations that could not easily be broken, for default carried not only economic consequences, but also political ones. Creditors could cut off funds, undermine confidence, or finance rivals. In this way, noble families who mastered finance became silent partners in the politics of Europe. Their influence exercised not through open rule, but through the quiet pressure of obligation. This hidden nature fed directly into the later perception of the Black Nobility, for their power seemed mysterious, operating behind the scenes, shaping outcomes without ever appearing on the stage. The Church's ambivalence toward finance reinforced this perception. Officially condemning usury, the papacy nevertheless relied on credit. This contradiction allowed noble families to position themselves as indispensable, while also cloaking their activities in secrecy. Financial contracts were written in technical language, their terms known only to insiders. Records were guarded carefully, and deals struck in private. To outsiders, the wealth and influence of these families seemed inexplicable, for the mechanisms of finance were hidden from view. The mystery of how they maintained power across centuries was explained by conspiracy theories and rumours, many of which contributed to the later mythology of the Black Nobility. Finance also provided resilience in the face of political upheaval. Land could be confiscated, castles besieged, titles revoked, but financial networks were mobile and adaptable. A banker could move operations to another city, transfer funds across borders, or conceal wealth in the ledgers of distant branches. This mobility allowed families to survive exile, defeat, or revolution. Even when expelled from their home cities, they could continue to operate through financial connections elsewhere, eventually returning when conditions allowed. The durability of financial networks ensured the durability of the families who controlled them. The Medici again stand as the clearest example. Their banking empire, tied to the papacy and spread across Europe, gave them leverage that no single city could provide. When they faced exile from Florence, their wealth and connections allowed them to regroup, return, and eventually establish themselves as dukes. Their transformation from bankers to rulers demonstrates the power of finance to reshape aristocracy itself, turning moneylenders into dynasts, creditors into sovereigns. Their story illustrates how the hidden power of finance could produce not only survival, but ascendancy. Genoese bankers provide another case. Their role in financing the Spanish Empire in the 16th century placed them at the centre of global politics. The flow of silver from the New World passed through their hands, and their credit sustained Spain's wars in Europe. Though Genoa itself was a relatively small republic, its noble families wielded influence that far exceeded its size, their fortunes tied to the fate of empires. Even as Spain's power waxed and waned, Genoese bankers ensured their own survival by diversifying their investments and maintaining their networks. This adaptability, rooted in finance, explains the extraordinary endurance of Genoese nobility across centuries. The hidden power of finance also had cultural implications. Noble families used their wealth to patronize art, architecture, and learning, projecting their influence through visible displays even as their true power remained invisible. Palaces, chapels, and libraries funded by bankers proclaimed their prestige, while behind the scenes their ledgers determined the fate of nations. This combination of visible splendour and hidden leverage created an aura of mystery and inevitability. To contemporaries, it seemed that these families could not be undone, for their roots lay not in fragile political structures, but in the very flows of money that underpinned the world. Over time, the stigma of usury faded, replaced by the recognition of finance as indispensable. Yet the memory of its prohibition lingered, reinforcing the idea that those who controlled it operated in a shadowy realm, manipulating necessity against morality. This perception contributed to the mythology of the Black Nobility, for the families associated with finance were seen as both indispensable and suspect, their power undeniable yet veiled in secrecy. By embedding themselves in the hidden structures of finance, noble families secured a permanence that transcended political regimes. They became not only lords of land or patrons of culture, but masters of the invisible currents of money that shaped the destiny of Europe. Their endurance through centuries of change testifies to the power of finance as the ultimate instrument of survival. From this foundation, they expanded their influence into dynasties like the Medici, the Borghese, and the Colonna, whose names still resonate as symbols of aristocratic permanence. The hidden power of finance prepared them for the transformations of the Renaissance, when patronage, ecclesiastical politics, and the consolidation of power would bring them to new heights of visibility and influence. The history of aristocratic survival in Italy becomes most vivid when examined through the lives of specific dynasties, for it is in the names of families such as the Medici, Borghese, Colonna, and Orsini that the strategies of endurance and influence can be seen most clearly. Each of these houses exemplifies a different aspect of the nobility's capacity to adapt and thrive across centuries. They stood at the crossroads of politics, finance, war, and religion, weaving themselves into the very fabric of Italy's history. Their legacies were not confined to their own lifetimes, but stretched across generations, becoming part of the enduring mythology of families that seemed immune to the passing of time. The Medici rose not from ancient senatorial roots, but from the mercantile and banking world of Florence. By the early 15th century, they had become the leading bankers of Europe, managing the finances of kings, merchants, and above all the papacy. Their wealth gave them leverage, but it was their political cunning that transformed them into rulers. Cosimo de' Medici, known as Cosimo the Elder, perfected the art of ruling without a title. Through patronage, strategic alliances, and control of Florence's institutions, he dominated the Republic while maintaining the facade of civic equality. His fortune allowed him to finance wars, sponsor cultural projects, and extend loans to allies, ensuring that loyalty to the Medici was both financially and politically rewarding. The Medici's power grew even greater in the hands of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Under his rule, Florence became the cultural heart of the Renaissance, with artists such as Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo benefiting from Medici patronage. Yet Lorenzo was not only a patron of art, he was a master of diplomacy, balancing alliances with other Italian states, negotiating with popes and kings, and keeping Florence stable during a time of turbulence. His ability to project both cultural brilliance and political strength cemented the Medici as more than bankers. They had become dynasts whose name was synonymous with Florence itself. Exile and return were recurring themes for the Medici. They were driven from Florence more than once, their fortunes seemingly destroyed, yet their financial networks and alliances always allowed them to return. In 1512, with papal and Spanish support, they re-established control, and by the mid-16th century they had transformed themselves into hereditary rulers. Cosimo Fas de' Medici became the Grand Duke of Tuscany, elevating the family into sovereign status. The Medici's survival from bankers to dukes illustrates the extraordinary adaptability of noble families, who could reinvent themselves to match the needs of changing times. Their marriages into European royalty, culminating in Catherine de' Medici's union with the French crown, spread their influence across the continent, ensuring that their name would echo in both Italian and French history. The Borghese family followed a different trajectory, one rooted deeply in the papacy. Originally of Sienese origin, they rose to prominence in Rome during the late Renaissance, achieving the height of their power under Pope Paul V, born Camillo Borghese. His papacy, from 1605 to 1621, cemented the family's status as one of the foremost in Rome. The Borghese became renowned for their cultural patronage, particularly in the arts. Cardinal Scipione Borghese, nephew of Paul V, assembled one of the greatest art collections in history, filling the Villa Borghese with masterpieces by Bernini, Caravaggio and Titian. This patronage was not merely aesthetic, it was a projection of family prestige, tying their name to the grandeur of the Counterreformation church. The Borghese also secured their power through strategic marriage alliances. Their union with the powerful Aldobrandini family brought them immense wealth and estates, while later marriages linked them to other aristocratic dynasties of Italy and Europe. By embedding themselves in both the spiritual authority of the papacy and the cultural prestige of Rome, the Borghese created an identity that outlasted individual popes and political shifts. Their palaces, collections and estates remain symbols of their endurance, standing as reminders of a family that transformed papal nepotism into lasting legacy. The Colonna family, by contrast, traced its lineage back to the earliest medieval aristocracy of Rome. They claimed descent from the ancient gens Julia and tied their identity to the continuity of Rome's legacy. For centuries they were among the most powerful families in the city, their fortunes tied to both the papacy and their vast estates. The Colonna were often at odds with the papacy, yet they always managed to survive conflicts that destroyed lesser families. Their rivalry with the Orsini defined much of Roman politics, with battles fought in the streets, castles besieged, and alliances forged and broken with dizzying speed. The Colonna demonstrated their adaptability by shifting allegiances when necessary. At times they aligned with the papacy, at others with the empire, and later with powerful monarchs such as Spain's Habsburgs. This flexibility ensured their survival, even when they faced papal excommunication or military defeat. Their estates in the Roman countryside, their fortified palaces in the city, and their connections abroad gave them resilience that no single defeat could erase. They also produced notable churchmen, including cardinals and bishops, ensuring that their influence extended into the spiritual sphere as well as the temporal. Their name became synonymous with Roman nobility itself, a byword for endurance in the face of constant turbulence. The Orsini, rivals of the Colonna, likewise built their identity on ancient lineage and service to the papacy. Their estates stretched across central Italy, and their castles guarded the approaches to Rome. They produced cardinals, condottieri, and popes, embedding themselves in every aspect of Roman politics. The Orsini were renowned for their military strength, often serving as commanders of papal armies or mercenary leaders in Italy's endless wars. Their ability to provide troops gave them leverage over the papacy, ensuring that no pope could ignore their demands. Like the Colonna, they suffered defeats, exiles, and confiscations, but they always returned, their resilience guaranteed by the breadth of their resources and the depth of their alliances. The Orsini's strategy also included extensive marriage alliances. They intermarried with other noble families of Italy, creating a network of kinship that extended their influence far beyond Rome. Their connection to the papacy was reinforced through nepotism, with Orsini cardinals and bishops wielding power within the church. Their cultural patronage, though less celebrated than that of the Medici or Borghese, nevertheless contributed to the identity of Rome as a city where aristocracy and the papacy were inseparable. Together, the Medici, Borghese, Colonna, and Orsini represent the different paths of aristocratic endurance. The Medici illustrate the transformation of bankers into sovereigns, leveraging finance and patronage to achieve dynastic continuity. The Borghese exemplify the fusion of papal nepotism and cultural patronage, using the papacy as a springboard into enduring prominence. The Colonna demonstrate the power of ancient lineage, flexibility, and resilience in the face of constant rivalry. The Orsini embody the martial and political dimension of Roman nobility, securing their survival through military strength and papal service. Each of these families exemplified the strategies of survival that defined the Black nobility: adaptability, marriage alliances, financial acumen, and integration into enduring institutions. Their legacies did not end with the Renaissance but continued into the modern age, their names echoing in the politics, culture, and memory of Italy. They remind us that aristocracy was not a relic of the past but a living force, capable of transforming itself to survive every upheaval. From their strategies, one can see the larger pattern of noble endurance, a pattern that continued into the age of secret orders, Jesuit influence, and the consolidation of power in early modern Europe. The endurance of noble families into the early modern world was not secured only by land, finance, or dynastic marriages. As the political and spiritual order of Europe changed in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found new vehicles of influence in religious orders, secret societies, and the mechanisms of centralized power that accompanied the Counterreformation. Among these, the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits, became one of the most effective instruments through which aristocracy extended its reach. Alongside the Jesuits existed a host of confraternities, chivalric orders, and secretive associations that allowed noble families to embed themselves in networks of influence that stretched across Europe and beyond. These structures, often cloaked in spirituality or secrecy, provided the framework for a new kind of aristocratic resilience, one less visible in fortresses and armies, but more pervasive in education, politics, and the governance of conscience itself. The Jesuits were founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, a former soldier whose vision combined military discipline with religious devotion. The Society of Jesus pledged absolute loyalty to the Pope, making it the perfect instrument for the papacy during the Counter-Reformation. Its members became renowned as educators, missionaries, and confessors to princes, their influence spreading rapidly across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. For noble families tied to the papacy, the rise of the Jesuits offered a new channel through which they could consolidate their power. By supporting the order, placing sons within its ranks, or aligning themselves with its missions, aristocratic houses secured a role in the intellectual and spiritual direction of Christendom. The Jesuit emphasis on education was particularly significant. They founded colleges and universities across Europe, training not only clergy but also the sons of the aristocracy. These institutions became breeding grounds for loyalty, instilling in their students a world view that combined rigorous intellect with devotion to the papacy. Noble families who sent their heirs to Jesuit schools ensured that the next generation was not only educated but also bound to networks of influence that extended into every corner of Europe. In this way, the Jesuits became both the tutors and the ideological allies of the Black Nobility, reinforcing their position as guardians of Catholic continuity. Confession was another key avenue of influence. Jesuits often served as confessors to kings, queens, and nobles, guiding their consciences and, through them, their policies. The intimacy of confession allowed Jesuits to exert subtle but profound influence over rulers, shaping decisions in ways that often aligned with the interests of the papacy and its aristocratic supporters. Noble families who aligned themselves with the order could count on their perspectives being carried into the inner chambers of royal courts, reinforcing their indirect influence over the destiny of nations. The Jesuits also excelled in diplomacy and politics. They negotiated treaties, advised monarchs, and acted as intermediaries between the papacy and secular rulers. Their mobility, discipline, and loyalty made them effective agents in conflicts that spanned continents. For the aristocracy, this meant that supporting or aligning with the Jesuits was equivalent to gaining a voice in international politics. Families that embedded themselves in Jesuit networks could project their influence far beyond their lands or cities, tying their fortunes to the broader Catholic struggle against Protestantism and the consolidation of papal authority. Yet the Jesuits were not the only network through which noble families extended their reach. Chivalric orders, confraternities, and secret societies proliferated in this period, offering aristocrats opportunities to bind themselves together in webs of loyalty and shared purpose. Some were overtly religious, such as the Knights of Malta, who defended Christian holdings in the Mediterranean and maintained close ties with the papacy. Membership in such orders conferred prestige, military connections, and access to resources. Others operated more discreetly, emphasizing secrecy, ritual, and mutual obligation. These secretive associations provided noble families with channels of communication and collaboration that bypassed formal political structures, allowing them to coordinate across regions and even across national boundaries. The idea of secrecy became a defining feature of aristocratic consolidation in this era. As Europe fractured along religious lines, with Protestant and Catholic states locked in conflict, noble families required networks that could operate discreetly, preserving their influence regardless of public allegiances. Secret orders allowed them to hedge their bets, aligning publicly with one side while maintaining ties with the other. These networks blurred the line between religion, politics, and espionage, creating an environment in which influence was exercised as much through hidden channels as through open rule. To later observers, this aura of secrecy fed directly into the mythology of the Black Nobility, reinforcing the perception that these families wielded power in ways invisible to the common eye. The consolidation of aristocratic power through such networks was not confined to Italy. Across Europe, noble families embedded themselves in the structures of the Counterreformation, aligning with the Jesuits, joining chivalric orders, and participating in secret societies. Spanish, Austrian, and French aristocrats all found in these institutions a means of reinforcing their authority and projecting it abroad. Yet in Italy, particularly in Rome and Venice, these networks acquired unique significance, for they intersected with the papacy itself. To be a member of the Jesuit order, a supporter of a confraternity, or an ally of a secret society was to be directly connected to the spiritual and political centre of Catholicism. The Jesuits also extended the reach of aristocracy into the New World and Asia. Their missions to China, Japan, India, and the Americas brought European influence to distant lands and noble families often sponsored or benefited from these endeavours. Jesuit reports from abroad circulated widely in Europe, shaping perceptions of global politics and trade. Aristocrats who aligned with these missions tied their fortunes to the expansion of Catholic influence worldwide, ensuring that their identity as guardians of tradition was projected into new frontiers. The global scope of Jesuit activity reinforced the universality of aristocratic networks, embedding them in the flows of empire, commerce and religion that characterized the early modern world. The backlash against the Jesuits also revealed the extent of their entanglement with aristocratic power. By the 18th century, their influence had grown so great that monarchs and secular governments began to fear them as a threat to sovereignty. The suppression of the order in 1773, under pressure from Bourbon monarchs, was a dramatic episode in which the hidden power of networks came into public view. Yet even in suppression, the Jesuits survived, sheltered by sympathetic aristocrats, and eventually restored in the 19th century. Their resilience mirrored that of the noble families themselves, for both relied on adaptability, secrecy, and the ability to embed themselves in enduring institutions. The interplay between noble families, the Jesuits, and secret orders underscores the larger pattern of aristocratic survival. By the early modern period, aristocracy was no longer defined solely by castles, armies, or estates. It was defined by networks: financial, dynastic, religious, and secret. These networks allowed families to project influence invisibly, to survive defeats, and to re-emerge stronger after periods of exile or suppression. Their consolidation of power was not always visible to contemporaries, but its effects were undeniable, shaping the politics of Europe and the fate of empires. The legacy of these networks fed directly into the mythology of the Black Nobility. To later critics and theorists, the very secrecy of Jesuit influence, the hidden channels of secret orders, and the quiet resilience of noble families seemed evidence of a conspiracy that transcended public politics. Whether one saw them as guardians of Catholic tradition or as shadow rulers manipulating events from behind the scenes, the impression of permanence and invisibility was the same. It was this impression that gave the Black Nobility its aura of mystery, an aura that continued to grow as these families carried their strategies into the age of centralized states and expanding commerce. From the Jesuits and secret orders, the story of aristocratic consolidation flows naturally into the broader transformations of the Renaissance and Counterreformation world, where noble families turned patronage, politics, and commerce into instruments of survival. Their ability to operate through visible power and hidden networks alike ensured that their influence remained constant, preparing them for the challenges of modernity and the adaptations that would follow in the centuries to come. The Renaissance was the age in which Italian noble families reached the height of their cultural prestige. Their palaces, collections, and patronage of artists defined an era when wealth and power were displayed not through military triumphs alone, but through the arts, letters, and architecture. Yet as the 16th century advanced, this culture of patronage gradually gave way to the sharper, more militant realities of the Counter-Reformation. The same families who had adorned Florence, Rome, and Venice with beauty now turned their resources toward defending Catholic orthodoxy, consolidating papal power, and navigating the turbulent politics of a Europe fractured by Protestant revolt. The transition from the Renaissance to the Counter-Reformation did not erase the aristocracy's role. Rather, it redefined it, forcing noble families to adapt once more to new ideological and political demands, while ensuring their survival in an increasingly centralized and contentious world. During the Renaissance, patronage had been both a cultural and a political strategy. Noble families, particularly in Florence and Rome, competed with each other to sponsor the greatest works of art and architecture. Their palaces were designed not merely as residences but as monuments to lineage and continuity. The Medici funded chapels and libraries, the Borghese filled villas with masterpieces, and the colonna adorned their estates with classical motifs. Artists and scholars were clients in the broadest sense, their work serving to project the prestige of the families who employed them. In commissioning a fresco, a sculpture, or a literary work, nobles were not indulging in art for art's sake, but reinforcing their identity as guardians of culture and heirs to antiquity. This culture of patronage also served to bind the aristocracy to the papacy. Popes sought to project Rome as the new capital of Christendom, adorned with the grandeur of both antiquity and Christianity. Noble families, eager to display loyalty and secure papal favour, poured resources into the construction of churches, chapels, and monuments. The result was the extraordinary flowering of art and architecture that still defines Rome today: St. Peter's Basilica, the Sistine Chapel, and countless palaces and villas. Each project was a collaboration between the papacy and noble patrons, each a statement of continuity between ancient Rome, Christian Rome, and the enduring families who claimed to embody both. Yet beneath the brilliance of the Renaissance, pressures were mounting that would alter the balance of power. The Protestant Reformation shattered the religious unity of Europe, challenging the authority of the papacy and threatening the foundations of Catholic aristocracy. For noble families tied to the Church, the rise of Protestant states represented not only a spiritual crisis but a political and financial one. Their legitimacy, rooted in papal authority and Catholic tradition, was now contested on a scale unseen since antiquity. Survival required adaptation, and once again the aristocracy proved equal to the challenge. The Counterreformation emerged as the Catholic response to Protestantism, and noble families became its indispensable agents. The Council of Trent, convened in the mid-16th century, codified Catholic doctrine, reformed abuses, and launched a campaign to reassert papal authority. Aristocrats supported these reforms both financially and politically, funding new seminaries, sponsoring religious orders, and aligning themselves with the militant defence of Catholicism. Where Renaissance patronage had emphasised beauty and culture, Counter-Reformation patronage emphasised orthodoxy, discipline, and the projection of Catholic strength. The Jesuits, central to the Counter-Reformation, became key allies of the nobility. Noble families endowed Jesuit colleges, sent their sons to be educated within them, and supported their missionary work. In return, the Jesuits reinforced the legitimacy of aristocratic rule, preaching obedience to authority and loyalty to the Church. The symbiosis between noble families and the Jesuits reflected the larger shift from Renaissance patronage to Counter-Reformation politics. The focus moved from cultural display to ideological defence, from projecting lineage through art to preserving authority through orthodoxy. Architecture and art themselves reflected this transformation. The Baroque style, which emerged during the Counter-Reformation, was theatrical, emotional, and explicitly religious. Noble families funded churches and chapels designed to inspire awe and devotion, reinforcing Catholic identity in a time of contest. The Borghese collection, for instance, became less a display of Renaissance humanism and more an assertion of Counter-Reformation grandeur, filled with works that emphasised religious themes, moral clarity, and the authority of the Church. Patronage continued, but it was reoriented toward the ideological needs of the moment. The politics of the Counter-Reformation also reshaped the role of noble families in international affairs. Europe became divided between Catholic and Protestant powers, and Italian aristocrats found themselves at the centre of the struggle. Their alliances, marriages, and financial networks linked them to Spain, Austria, and France, the great Catholic monarchies of the era. The Colonna, for example, often aligned themselves with Spain, securing their position by embedding themselves in Habsburg networks. The Medici, as Dukes of Tuscany, balanced between France and Spain, using marriage alliances to tie themselves to both. Survival required navigating this complex web of alliances, ensuring that whichever Catholic monarchy prevailed, their families remained indispensable. The Counterreformation also intensified the integration of noble families into the machinery of the papacy. Nepotism, long a feature of papal politics, became even more central, as popes relied on their relatives to enforce discipline and administer reforms. Noble nephews were appointed cardinals, bishops, and governors of papal territories, embedding their families in the very structure of Catholic renewal. The Barberini, who rose to prominence under Pope Urban VI, illustrate this dynamic vividly. Through papal nepotism, they amassed wealth, power, and patronage networks that rivaled those of older dynasties, demonstrating how even new families could secure permanence through service to the Counter-Reformation papacy. The military dimension of the Counter-Reformation further reinforced noble authority. Wars of religion raged across Europe, from the French Wars of Religion to the 30 Years' War, and noble families provided the generals, soldiers, and resources needed for Catholic defence. Their estates supplied troops, their credit financed campaigns, and their sons commanded armies in the name of Pope and King alike. This martial role tied their survival to the broader fortunes of Catholic Europe, ensuring that their legitimacy was inseparable from the success of the Counter-Reformation itself. The transformation from Renaissance patronage to Counter-Reformation politics did not eliminate the cultural role of noble families but redirected it. They continued to sponsor artists and intellectuals, but the emphasis shifted toward religious orthodoxy and the projection of Catholic authority. They continued to build palaces and churches, but these now served as monuments to the resilience of Catholic identity rather than as displays of personal humanist brilliance. Their patronage remained a tool of survival, but its purpose evolved to meet the demands of an age defined by ideological struggle. What emerges from this transition is a portrait of aristocracy that was anything but stagnant. The same families who had adorned Florence with Renaissance brilliance, or filled Rome with classical grandeur, proved equally capable of funding Baroque churches, supporting Jesuit colleges, and financing wars of religion. Their ability to shift seamlessly from one mode of patronage to another, from humanist culture to militant orthodoxy, demonstrates the adaptability that lay at the heart of their endurance. They were not relics of the past, but living institutions, capable of reinventing themselves to meet each new challenge. This adaptability fed directly into the later perception of the Black Nobility. To outsiders, it seemed that these families were always present, always influential, no matter how radically the world around them changed. Whether the age called for humanist patronage or militant orthodoxy, they were ready, using their resources to align themselves with the dominant currents of the time. Their resilience seemed uncanny, as if they possessed a hidden knowledge of how to survive. In reality, it was their mastery of adaptation, their ability to pivot from Renaissance to Counter-Reformation without losing continuity, that ensured their survival. From the vantage point of history, the shift from Renaissance patronage to Counter-Reformation politics represents not a rupture, but a continuation of the same strategies in new form. Noble families remained at the centre of culture, politics, and religion, but they adjusted their role to the demands of the Counter-Reformation world. Their endurance through this transformation prepared them for the next stage of European history, when Venice's oligarchy, papal authority, and aristocratic networks would confront the challenges of global trade, new empires, and the gradual shift from nobility of blood to aristocracy of capital. The story of Venice in the late medieval and early modern world is inseparable from the idea of control. More than any other republic of Italy, Venice defined itself by the mastery of routes, whether by sea or land, whether carrying spices from the east, wool from England, or silver from the New World. Its nobility, long since closed into a hereditary caste, became the custodians of these routes, turning geography into monopoly and commerce into power. To later generations, this monopoly was one of the clearest reasons why the Venetian patriciate was remembered as the very heart of the so-called Black Nobility, for their survival depended not on land or titles, but on their ability to dominate the flows of goods, credit, and information that connected the world. Venice's position on the Adriatic made it the natural gatekeeper of trade between East and West. From its earliest days, the Republic profited by serving as a mediator between the Byzantine Empire and the Latin West, carrying goods across seas and distributing them through Italian markets. By the time of the Crusades, Venice had transformed this intermediary role into outright control. The Fourth Crusade, diverted under Venetian leadership to sack Constantinople in 1204, symbolised the ruthlessness of this ambition. Venetian nobles returned from that campaign with not only treasures but also territories and privileges that cemented their dominance of Eastern commerce. They secured colonies, outposts, and trading concessions that gave them near monopoly over key routes into the Byzantine and later Ottoman spheres. The lifeblood of Venice was spices: pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These were not luxuries but essentials of European kitchens, medicines, and economies. The Venetian Black Nobility controlled the passage of these goods from the ports of Alexandria and Constantinople into Europe. By negotiating exclusive privileges with Mamluk sultans and later bargaining with the Ottomans, they ensured that no other European power could access these riches without passing through Venetian hands. Their ships, organised into convoys and escorted by armed galleys, carried spices into the markets of Venice, where they were distributed across the continent. The profits were staggering, and the families who controlled this trade entrenched themselves at the very top of European wealth. Yet Venice was not content to rely on spices alone. Grain from the Black Sea, furs from Russia, silk from Persia, and cotton from Egypt all flowed through its ports. Venetian merchants established colonies in Crete, Cyprus, and Corfu, turning these islands into vital staging points in the web of trade. Patrician families administered these colonies, ensuring that their own fortunes were tied directly to the lifelines of commerce. To govern Crete or Cyprus was not merely to oversee a province, it was to sit astride the arteries that fed Europe's hunger for goods. The Venetian Black Nobility understood this better than anyone, and they guarded these possessions fiercely, often against rivals such as Genoa or later the Ottoman Turks. The Venetian monopoly on trade routes was not purely maritime. Overland routes into Germany and Central Europe were equally important. Venice cultivated ties with Augsburg, Nuremberg, and other commercial centres of the Holy Roman Empire, ensuring that Venetian goods moved swiftly northward. Patrician families maintained agents, warehouses, and banks across these regions, extending their reach deep into continental markets. The ducat, Venice's gold coin, became one of the most trusted currencies of Europe, further evidence of how tightly the Black Nobility bound themselves to the mechanics of trade. The system of convoys, or mude, demonstrates how deliberately Venice managed its commercial empire. These were state-organised fleets that sailed at fixed times to fixed destinations: Flanders, Alexandria, Constantinople, carrying goods, letters, and passengers under the protection of Venetian warships. Participation in these convoys was restricted to patricians, who financed them collectively and shared in the profits. This arrangement eliminated much of the risk of piracy or loss, while ensuring that the wealth generated flowed directly into noble hands. The mude were more than commercial expeditions. They were instruments of oligarchic control, designed to keep commerce in the hands of the Black Nobility and exclude outsiders. The secrecy of Venetian politics extended into the management of these routes. Decisions about convoys, treaties, and privileges were made in the closed chambers of the Senate or the Council of Ten, inaccessible to outsiders. The nobility controlled not only the ships and goods, but also the flow of information. They maintained networks of spies and informants across Europe and the Mediterranean, gathering intelligence on markets, rivals, and politics. This control of information was as vital as the control of spices, for it allowed Venetian nobles to anticipate shifts, exploit opportunities, and suppress competition. To many observers, it seemed that the Venetian patriciate knew everything, controlled everything, and permitted nothing to escape their gaze, a perception that fed directly into the later myth of their shadowy power. The Ottomans presented the greatest challenge to Venetian dominance, yet even here the Black Nobility demonstrated their adaptability. When Constantinople fell to Mehmet II in 1453, it seemed that Venice's access to the east was doomed. Yet Venetian diplomats quickly negotiated treaties with the new Ottoman rulers, securing continued privileges in exchange for tribute and concessions. This ability to pivot to recognise the permanence of Ottoman power and turn it into partnership rather than catastrophe is what allowed Venice to survive where others faltered. The Venetian Black Nobility did not cling to ideology, but pursued survival through commerce, adapting to the realities of power while preserving their monopolies. The rise of Portugal and Spain in the 16th century, with their new roots around Africa and into the New World, posed another existential threat. Spices could now bypass the Mediterranean entirely, arriving in Lisbon or Seville without passing through Venice. Once again, the nobility adapted. They diversified their investments, turning more heavily toward finance, manufacturing and continental trade. They also sought to maintain control over Eastern goods that still passed through Ottoman lands, bargaining for every privilege and concession. Though Venice's supremacy diminished, its patriciates survived by embedding themselves in other forms of commerce, and by maintaining their hold on whatever routes remained open to them. This control of trade routes gave the Venetian Black Nobility an influence that extended far beyond their lagoon. Their goods filled markets from London to Krakow, their currency stabilised international trade, and their agents operated in courts across Europe. They were indispensable to the functioning of the continent's economy, and this indispensability ensured their endurance. No monarch could afford to alienate them completely, for to do so was to risk losing access to the lifeblood of commerce. Even as Europe's centres of power shifted westward, the Venetian aristocracy remained embedded in the networks of trade and finance, invisible but inescapable. The image of the Venetian patrician thus became one of shadowy permanence. To outsiders, they seemed to operate behind the scenes, directing commerce and politics alike from their closed council chambers. Their refusal to open their ranks, their obsession with secrecy, and their monopoly on trade routes combined to create an aura of mystery. Critics accused them of manipulation, conspiracy, and hidden rule, while admirers praised their stability and rational governance. Both perceptions contained truth, and both fed into the idea of Venice as the archetype of the Black Nobility. This mastery of trade routes was not simply about wealth, it was about survival. By controlling the flows of goods, the Venetian Black Nobility controlled the very arteries of Europe's economy. They could weather wars, plagues, and revolutions because their power was rooted not in fragile institutions, but in the enduring necessity of commerce. So long as people needed spices, grain, silk, or silver, the families who controlled their passage would remain indispensable. This indispensability was the secret of their longevity, and it explains why their influence stretched across centuries when other states and dynasties crumbled. The Venetian model of survival through control of trade routes prepared the ground for the next phase of aristocratic endurance. As the early modern world shifted towards centralised nation-states and the rise of an aristocracy of capital, the strategies honed in Venice, exclusivity, secrecy, and commercial dominance, became the foundation upon which other noble families built their survival. From the lagoon's oligarchs, the story of the Black Nobility expands into the broader transformations of Europe, where ancient houses learned to adapt to the modern age by fusing their lineage with capital, commerce, and the institutions of the state. By the dawn of the modern age, the traditional markers of nobility were undergoing profound transformation. For centuries, aristocratic identity had been bound to lineage, land, and service to the papacy or empire. Castles, armies, and genealogies were the visible emblems of continuity. Yet as Europe entered the 16th and 17th centuries, the foundations of wealth and power shifted. Commerce expanded beyond the Mediterranean, global trade routes opened, and finance assumed a central role in statecraft. In this environment, the survival of the old aristocracy depended on its ability to reinvent itself, to convert noble identity into a new form, an aristocracy of capital. Families who managed this transition became the enduring pillars of influence, their names still resonating in the politics and finance of Europe long after feudal lords and medieval republics had faded into memory. The seeds of this transformation had been planted in Venice, Genoa and Florence, where nobles had already blurred the lines between aristocracy and commerce. Venetian patricians had long treated ships as estates, trade routes as fiefs, and commerce as the lifeblood of their nobility. Genoese houses such as the Dorias and Spinolas had combined naval power with banking empires, financing monarchs and empires while commanding fleets. The Medici had demonstrated how banking dynasties could transform themselves into sovereign dukes. These precedents provided the template for the rest of Europe, where aristocracy gradually learned to fuse its lineage with capital. One of the clearest markers of this transition was the growing dependence of monarchies on credit. The rise of centralized states required resources on a scale that feudal dues and traditional taxation could not provide. Wars of religion, imperial conquests and standing armies demanded vast sums of money, and kings increasingly turned to bankers for support. Noble families who controlled banking houses or who invested in state loans became indispensable to monarchs. Their fortunes were tied not to the harvests of their estates, but to the solvency of kingdoms. In Spain, the crown leaned heavily on Genoese financiers. In France, nobles invested in state debt. In the Papal States, aristocratic bankers ensured that papal ambitions could be funded. Through finance, the nobility embedded itself in the very machinery of the modern state. The stigma once attached to usury faded as necessity overcame doctrine. By the 17th century, the prohibition on interest was increasingly ignored, and finance was recognized as essential to governance. This shift allowed noble families to operate more openly in banking and commerce, shedding the secrecy that had once surrounded their financial activities. Yet even as the stigma diminished, the perception of hidden power remained. To many observers, it seemed that noble families had found a way to control states through invisible chains of debt, pulling strings from behind the scenes while kings appeared to rule. The mythology of the Black Nobility grew in this atmosphere, for the blending of a noble lineage with financial power created an aura of permanence and mystery. The integration of nobility into commerce was not limited to finance. Global trade offered new opportunities for investment, and aristocrats were quick to seize them. The Dutch and English East India companies became models of early modern capitalism, and Italian nobles invested in their ventures or imitated their practices. The Venetian and Genoese experience with colonial outposts translated naturally into the world of overseas trade, where nobles financed voyages, managed colonies, and profited from the circulation of goods. Spices, sugar, tobacco, and later cotton became the new lifeblood of aristocratic wealth, and noble families who invested in these trades ensured that their fortunes kept pace with the expanding global economy. This shift also redefined the symbols of aristocracy. Where once a family's prestige was displayed through castles and coats of arms, now it was increasingly visible in palaces funded by commercial wealth, collections filled with objects from around the world, and networks of credit that extended across continents. The Borghese Villa, the Medici collections, and the Genoese palaces of the Strada Nuova were not simply residences. They were monuments to the fusion of lineage and capital. They proclaimed that the old aristocracy had not been displaced by commerce, but had absorbed it, turning global trade into a new form of nobility. The transition into an aristocracy of capital also had profound implications for dynastic strategy. Marriage alliances, long the cornerstone of aristocratic continuity, now incorporated commercial considerations. A union was valuable not only for its dowry in land or titles, but for its access to trade routes, banking networks or colonial enterprises. Noble families married into merchant dynasties, blending old blood with new wealth. The result was a hybrid aristocracy that combined the prestige of ancient lineage with the resources of commerce, ensuring continuity in an age when traditional forms of power were increasingly insufficient. The Medici illustrate this hybridization vividly. By the 17th century, their role as Dukes of Tuscany was inseparable from their banking legacy. They managed trade through the port of Livorno, attracted merchants from across Europe, and invested in industries ranging from textiles to mining. Their nobility was no longer a matter of feudal obligation, but of capital management. Their dynasty endured because it adapted to the new economic order, embedding itself in the flows of commerce that defined modern Europe. The Genoese aristocracy provides another striking example. Though their city was plagued by factional strife, Genoese nobles survived by transforming themselves into international financiers. They became the bankers of Spain, managing the silver that flowed from the Americas into European markets. Their credit sustained the Spanish crown, their fortunes tied directly to the greatest empire of the age. Even when Spain defaulted on its debts, Genoese families endured by diversifying their investments and maintaining their networks. Their resilience demonstrated the strength of aristocracy, rooted in capital rather than land, for while kingdoms could falter, the flows of money and trade continued. This transformation also reshaped the role of the papacy in aristocratic survival. As the Counterreformation consolidated papal authority, noble families tied to Rome invested heavily in banking, trade, and finance. The Borghese, Barberini, and Chigi exemplify this shift. They used papal patronage to secure positions of influence, but their survival depended increasingly on their ability to manage capital. They lent money to monarchs, invested in commerce, and turned their cultural patronage into a display of financial as well as spiritual power. In this way, the papal nobility became fully integrated into the aristocracy of capital, ensuring that their survival was tied not only to the church but also to the broader economy of Europe. The aristocracy of capital also influenced the cultural and intellectual life of Europe. The financing of universities, academies, and scientific endeavours became new forms of patronage, replacing the purely artistic focus of the Renaissance. Noble families invested in the sciences, navigation, and exploration, recognising that knowledge itself had become a form of capital. The Jesuits, supported by aristocratic patrons, established schools and missions that extended this intellectual influence globally. To be a noble in the modern age meant not only to guard tradition, but also to participate in the cutting edge of knowledge, commerce, and politics. This redefinition of nobility prepared the ground for the survival of aristocratic families through the upheavals of the 18th and 19th centuries. Revolutions, wars, and the rise of nation-states destroyed many traditional forms of power, but families who had transformed themselves into aristocracies of capital endured. They survived not because they clung to feudal privileges, but because they had embedded themselves in the economic structures that no state could do without. Their wealth was invisible, mobile, and essential, making them resilient in ways that older forms of nobility could never match. From this point onward, the endurance of aristocratic families was less a matter of military defence or papal patronage, and more a matter of economic indispensability. They had become part of the hidden infrastructure of modern states, financiers of wars, investors in trade, and managers of credit. Their survival no longer depended on the authority of emperors or popes, but on the universal need for capital. In this way, the nobility of lineage became the aristocracy of capital, ensuring continuity even as Europe moved into the modern age. This transformation, rooted in centuries of adaptation, explains why the same families reappeared in history again and again, from the medieval world of papal politics to the modern world of finance and commerce. Their ability to reinvent themselves, to shift from guardians of Rome to patrons of the Renaissance, from condottieri to bankers, from feudal lords to capitalists, made them seem indestructible. It is this sense of continuity, this aura of permanence that lies at the heart of the idea of the Black Nobility, an aristocracy that survives not by resisting change but by absorbing it. The rise of nation-states in the early modern period reshaped the political landscape of Europe, consolidating authority into centralised monarchies that gradually displaced the patchwork of feudal domains and city republics. For many, this was an age of kings, dynasties, and national identity. Yet behind the visible authority of monarchs stood the enduring presence of noble families, whose influence had already been secured through centuries of adaptation. The transition from fragmented medieval polities to centralised states did not eliminate the aristocracy, but rather forced it to redefine its role. Families often grouped under the idea of the Black Nobility became indispensable partners in the formation of these nation-states, embedding themselves in their institutions, financing their ambitions, and ensuring that their survival was tied directly to the very process of state-building. The first key role they played was financial. Nation-states required resources on a scale that far exceeded the capacity of traditional taxation. Standing armies, permanent bureaucracies, and overseas empires demanded constant flows of money. Noble families, already masters of finance through their experience in banking and trade, provided the credit that sustained monarchies. Genoese financiers underpinned the Spanish crown, managing the vast influx of silver from the Americas and turning it into the lifeblood of Spain's imperial wars. Florentine and Roman bankers provided loans to French monarchs, financing conflicts that shaped the destiny of Europe. Venetian patricians, though tied to their own republic, invested in ventures that extended into the affairs of other states. Through these financial networks, noble families became the invisible partners of nation-building, ensuring that kings could wage wars and expand territories. Finance also gave aristocrats leverage. Monarchs indebted to noble families could not easily act against them, no matter how absolute their claims to authority. Debt tied rulers to the very families who funded their ambitions, creating a symbiotic relationship. Aristocrats survived not by resisting the growth of monarchies, but by embedding themselves within their structures, ensuring that the survival of the crown was also the survival of the families who financed it. In this way, the Black Nobility became the hidden foundation of nation-states, their power less visible than that of kings but equally indispensable. Marriage alliances reinforced this integration. As monarchies consolidated, noble families ensured their relevance by marrying into royal dynasties. The Medici's union with the French crown through Catherine de' Medici is perhaps the most famous example, but it was far from unique. The Colonna, Orsini, Borghese, and other Roman dynasties tied themselves through marriage to Spanish and Austrian houses, embedding their lineage within the Habsburg Empire. Genoese nobles linked themselves to the Spanish monarchy not only through finance, but also through unions that tied their fortunes to the crown. These marriages transformed aristocrats into relatives of kings, ensuring that their survival was bound to the very dynasties that defined nation-states. Service in royal courts and bureaucracies provided another avenue of influence. As monarchies centralised power, they required administrators, diplomats, and generals. Noble families provided these in abundance. Jesuit-educated sons of aristocrats became royal advisors, shaping policies from within. Aristocratic commanders led armies on behalf of monarchs, their loyalty rewarded with titles and lands that tied them to the emerging nation. Others served as ambassadors, navigating the delicate diplomacy that defined early modern Europe. Through these roles, the nobility ensured that they remained not rivals, but pillars of centralised authority, indispensable to the functioning of monarchies. The Church remained a crucial bridge between noble families and nation-states. The Counterreformation bound Catholic monarchies to the papacy, and through it, to the noble families who dominated papal politics. Aristocratic cardinals and bishops served not only Rome but also the interest of monarchies, aligning papal authority with national ambitions. This dual role reinforced the place of noble families at the intersection of spiritual and temporal power, ensuring that their influence extended into both church and state. The Jesuits, with their ties to noble patrons, deepened this connection, shaping the education and conscience of monarchs in ways that reflected aristocratic interests. Even in Protestant states, noble families adapted to the rise of centralised authority. In England and Northern Europe, where Catholic ties could be liabilities, aristocrats nevertheless reinvented themselves as financiers, courtiers, and landowners whose survival was tied to the monarchy. Their strategies mirrored those of their Catholic counterparts, embedding themselves in the structures of state power while preserving their dynastic continuity. The adaptability of aristocracy, honed over centuries of turbulence, ensured that no single religious or political transformation could eliminate them. The wars of the 16th and 17th centuries further demonstrated the indispensability of noble families. The 30 Years' War, which devastated Central Europe, was fought not only by kings and princes but also by aristocratic generals whose loyalty and resources shaped the outcome. Families who aligned themselves skillfully with the victors ensured their survival, while those who miscalculated often disappeared. Yet even defeat could be mitigated by the web of dynastic and financial connections that allowed exiled nobles to regroup and re-emerge. The resilience of aristocratic families during these wars reinforced their image as permanent fixtures of European politics, surviving even when states themselves collapsed or transformed. In many cases, noble families anticipated the rise of nation-states and positioned themselves accordingly. They invested in industries that supported national economies, such as textiles, shipbuilding, and armaments. They sponsored academies and institutions that trained bureaucrats and soldiers, embedding themselves in the intellectual and cultural foundations of statehood. Their palaces became centres of political life, hosting gatherings where policies were debated and alliances forged. In this way, aristocracy did not resist the emergence of nation-states, but actively shaped them, ensuring that their survival was tied to the very process of modernization. The adaptability of noble families during the rise of nation-states underscores the central theme of continuity. They were not swept aside by the growth of centralized monarchies, but integrated themselves into them, transforming from feudal lords into financiers, courtiers, and dynastic allies. Their resilience lay in their ability to recognize where power was shifting and to place themselves at its heart. This strategy ensured that they survived revolutions, wars, and reforms, always reappearing in new forms that reflected the demands of the age. The perception of aristocrats as the hidden partners of monarchies contributed to the later mythology of the Black Nobility. To many observers, it seemed that noble families remained powerful no matter how the surface of politics changed. Whether in the courts of Spain, the bureaucracy of France, or the papal curia in Rome, they were always present, always indispensable, always enduring. Their power was not always visible, but it was always felt, shaping the destinies of nations through finance, marriage, service, and faith. As nation-states matured, this integration of noble families into their structures laid the groundwork for the endurance of aristocracy into the modern era. The Black Nobility, as a concept, captures this enduring presence, the sense that behind every crown and every state, there remained families whose survival was guaranteed by centuries of adaptation. Their role in the rise of nation-states was not peripheral but central, ensuring that the transition from medieval fragmentation to centralized authority did not eliminate the aristocracy but transformed it into a new, more resilient form. From this position of integration, noble families moved into the next era of European history, when revolutions and modern ideologies would threaten the old order. Yet even then, their resilience, rooted now in capital, dynastic networks, and the institutions of nation-states themselves, would allow them to endure. The lesson of the rise of nation-states was clear. Nobility had ceased to be merely a relic of feudalism, and had become an integral part of modern political life. preparing them for survival through even greater upheavals in centuries to come. The 18th and 19th centuries brought upheavals on a scale that few earlier generations could have imagined. Monarchies toppled, republics rose, revolutions swept across continents, and ideologies promised to overturn centuries of hierarchy. In France, the revolution struck directly at the nobility, abolishing titles, confiscating estates, and sending aristocrats to the guillotine. Across Europe, wars of liberation and nationalist movements challenged the old structures of power. To many contemporaries, it seemed as if aristocracy itself was doomed, a relic of feudalism swept away by the tide of modernity. Yet when the dust settled, the same noble families were still present, their names still familiar, their influence still felt. The survival of aristocratic power through revolutions is one of the clearest demonstrations of the adaptability that had defined their existence for centuries. The French Revolution provides the most dramatic example. The aristocracy of France appeared to be destroyed in the 1790s, its privileges stripped, its estates nationalised, and thousands of nobles executed or driven into exile. Yet the old families did not vanish. Many fled abroad, carrying with them not only their names but also their networks and financial resources. They took refuge in Britain, Austria, Spain, and Italy, often welcomed by relatives connected through marriage alliances that spanned Europe. These exiled aristocrats maintained their identity in foreign courts, waiting for the chance to return. With the fall of Napoleon and the Bourbon Restoration in 1814, many did return, reclaiming lands, titles, and influence. Though their privileges were diminished, their survival as a class demonstrated once again the resilience of families whose continuity rested not on temporary institutions, but on centuries of adaptation. In Italy, where revolutions and uprisings periodically shook the peninsula throughout the 19th century, the story was similar. Noble families adjusted to shifting political regimes, whether French occupation, Austrian domination, or the eventual unification of Italy. The Colonna, Orsini, Borghese, and other Roman houses navigated the turbulence by preserving their estates, marrying into new elites, and aligning themselves with the Papal states, or later, the Kingdom of Italy. Their survival was aided by the fact that their wealth was not only in land but also in capital and cultural assets. Villas, art collections, and financial holdings were harder to confiscate or destroy than titles, and they continued to provide prestige and leverage even when political authority shifted. The revolutions of 1848, which swept across much of Europe, further tested the endurance of the nobility. In many cities, radical movements demanded the abolition of aristocratic privilege and the redistribution of power, yet even where concessions were forced, aristocrats often managed to preserve their social and economic dominance. Their estates remained productive, their networks intact, and their alliances with monarchies and the church unbroken. In some cases, they even adapted by embracing aspects of the revolutionary cause, presenting themselves as enlightened nobles willing to reform in order to preserve continuity. This ability to bend without breaking was a hallmark of their survival, allowing them to outlast movements that promised to erase them. The survival of aristocratic power during revolutions was not merely passive, it was often the result of active strategy. Families diversified their wealth, investing in industries and commerce that thrived under new regimes. They sent their children into the professions, law, diplomacy, finance, embedding themselves in the new structures of power. They patronized the arts and sciences, presenting themselves as cultural leaders in times of upheaval. They cultivated ties with foreign powers, ensuring that they had patrons and protectors even when domestic politics turned hostile. Each of these strategies reflected a deliberate effort to ensure that aristocracy was never entirely dependent on a single regime or institution. The endurance of the nobility also benefited from the fact that revolutions were rarely as thorough as their rhetoric suggested. Even in France, where the revolutionaries declared war on aristocracy itself, The complexities of governance eventually forced accommodations. Exiled nobles were recalled, marriages between old and new elites created hybrids, and aristocratic names reappeared in government and culture. In Italy, Germany and Austria, revolutions often ended with partial reforms rather than total transformations, allowing noble families to reassert themselves once the immediate crisis had passed. The very instability of revolutionary politics provided opportunities for aristocrats to return, for their continuity gave them an advantage over movements that flared brightly but briefly. The adaptability of noble families during these upheavals reinforced the perception that they were indestructible. To ordinary people, it seemed uncanny that the same names reappeared after every revolution, every war, every change of regime. The explanation lay not in conspiracy but in strategy. Centuries of survival had taught aristocrats how to hedge their bets, preserve their assets, and reinsert themselves into new systems. Their identity was not tied to any single ideology, but to the art of endurance itself. They survived kings, republics, empires, and revolutions because they were never entirely invested in one form of authority, but always ready to adapt to the next. The survival of aristocracy through revolutions also reshaped its role in the modern world. No longer able to rely on feudal privileges or unquestioned hierarchy, noble families increasingly defined themselves through wealth, culture, and influence rather than formal authority. They became financiers, industrialists, patrons of the arts, and leaders of social life. Their palaces became salons where intellectuals, politicians, and artists mingled. Their art collections became symbols of cultural leadership. Their marriages tied them to the rising bourgeoisie, blending old lineage with new money in ways that ensured continuity. By redefining themselves in this way, they turned revolutions that might have destroyed them into opportunities for reinvention. This reinvention also explains the persistence of the idea of the Black Nobility in modern thought. To later generations, it seemed that noble families had survived every upheaval, not by chance, but by hidden power. The secrecy of their networks, the continuity of their names, and their ability to adapt gave them an aura of mystery. Conspiracy theories flourished, portraying them as shadow rulers manipulating revolutions for their own benefit, while the reality was more often a matter of adaptability than conspiracy. The perception of hidden endurance became part of their legacy, reinforcing the idea that aristocracy operated behind the scenes even when it appeared to have been overthrown. By the late 19th century, the survival of aristocracy through revolutions had transformed it into something new. No longer the unquestioned rulers of feudal domains, noble families had become the arbiters of culture, finance, and social prestige in modern states. Their names continued to carry weight, not because of titles alone, but because of the centuries of continuity they represented. They were survivors in the truest sense, embodying the lesson that power lies not only in armies or laws, but in the ability to endure. From the revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, noble families carried their strategies into the 20th, when world wars, dictatorships, and new political ideologies would once again challenge their survival. Yet just as before, they adapted, embedding themselves in new systems and preserving their continuity. The revolutions that promised to destroy them instead became chapters in a longer story of resilience, a story that reveals the essence of aristocratic endurance in the face of history's most violent upheavals. The 19th and 20th centuries presented challenges to aristocracy, unlike anything seen before. Industrialization, nationalism, democracy, and world wars reshaped the map of Europe, sweeping away monarchies and empires that had defined the continent for centuries. The rise of modern ideologies, liberalism, socialism, fascism, communism, declared the end of hereditary privilege, promising to replace it with new forms of government and society. Yet through all of this upheaval, the old noble families did not vanish. They adapted once more, as they had done countless times before, finding new ways to preserve their influence in a political world that no longer formally depended on them, but still valued their wealth, networks, and cultural authority. The 19th century began with the aftershocks of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had sought to dismantle the old order, abolishing feudal privileges, redistributing land, and creating new elites loyal to his regime. Yet even as he attempted to erase the power of traditional aristocracy, many noble families survived by aligning themselves with his empire or by maintaining their influence in exile. Some even entered Napoleon's administration, serving as generals, diplomats, or administrators. Others quietly preserved their estates and resources, waiting for the moment when Europe returned to monarchy. That moment came with the Congress of Vienna in 1815, when the victorious powers restored many of the old dynasties and reaffirmed aristocratic influence in the balance of European politics. The 19th century also witnessed the rise of nationalism and the unification of states such as Italy and Germany. These movements threatened the old patchwork of noble power, for they replaced local and regional authority with centralized nationhood. Yet noble families again adapted. In Italy, the Colonna, Orsini and Borghese families integrated themselves into the new Kingdom of Italy, serving in its parliament, military and diplomatic corps. In Germany, noble families from Prussia and Bavaria aligned themselves with the new empire under the Hohenzollerns. The transition was not always smooth, but it demonstrated the same pattern of endurance. Rather than resisting new national identities outright, aristocrats found ways to present themselves as natural guardians of tradition within the framework of modern nation-states. Industrialization presented an even greater challenge. Wealth was no longer defined by land or lineage, but increasingly by industry, commerce, and finance. To survive, noble families invested in railroads, banks, mines, and factories, often partnering with the rising bourgeoisie. Marriage alliances between nobles and wealthy industrialists became common, blending old names with new fortunes. These unions preserved aristocratic continuity, while also giving legitimacy to the newly rich, creating a hybrid elite that dominated much of Europe's social and political life. In cities such as Paris, Vienna, and Rome, noble palaces became centres where aristocrats and industrialists mingled, their alliances reinforcing the permanence of elite power even as its forms changed. The cultural sphere remained another crucial arena for aristocratic adaptation. In the 19th century, as political authority became more contested, noble families increasingly defined themselves through patronage of the arts, sciences, and social causes. They sponsored operas, museums, and universities, projecting themselves as guardians of culture in an age of transformation. The Borghese collections in Rome, the Medici legacy in Florence, and countless other examples reinforced the idea that nobility remained synonymous with cultural leadership. Even when stripped of political privilege, aristocrats could still command respect through their role as curators of heritage and tradition. The 20th century, however, brought challenges that tested aristocracy to the core. The First World War shattered empires that had long been the foundation of aristocratic identity. The Habsburgs, Romanovs, and Hohenzollerns fell, and with them entire systems of titles, privileges, and dynastic hierarchies. In Italy, the monarchy survived the war but faced growing instability, while in Germany the Kaiser's abdication marked the end of imperial aristocracy. Yet, once again, noble families adapted. Many preserved their estates and resources by aligning themselves with new republican governments, shifting their influence into business, finance, and diplomacy. Others went into exile, relying on the international networks that had always sustained aristocratic survival. The rise of fascism in the 1920s and 1930s presented another test. In Italy, Mussolini initially sought to marginalise the old nobility, portraying his regime as a revolution of the modern state. Yet practical necessity led him to rely on aristocrats for legitimacy, diplomacy, and cultural prestige. Noble families such as the Colonna and Borgheses maintained positions of influence, some aligning with the regime, others keeping their distance but preserving their assets. In Germany, certain aristocratic families aligned with the Nazis, while others resisted or plotted against them. The most famous example is the 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, in which several German nobles participated. The diversity of responses highlights the adaptability of aristocracy, which once again ensured survival by embedding itself on both sides of ideological conflict. The Second World War and its aftermath brought even greater transformations. Monarchies fell in Italy and across Eastern Europe, and communist regimes declared war on aristocracy itself. Estates were confiscated, titles abolished, and many nobles forced into exile. Yet exile itself became another form of survival, as families drew on their international marriages and networks to preserve their continuity abroad. Some integrated themselves into the social elites of Britain, France, and the United States, while others reinvented themselves as businessmen, academics, or cultural figures. Even under communism, where aristocracy appeared to have been eliminated, families preserved their identity in private, passing down names, traditions, and networks that re-emerged after the fall of the Soviet bloc. One of the most remarkable aspects of the 20th century was the persistence of aristocratic names in positions of influence, despite the formal abolition of privilege. Descendants of noble families became leaders in finance, politics, and culture, their heritage providing a kind of invisible capital that continued to command respect. Their estates were often transformed into museums or cultural institutions, ensuring that their legacy remained visible. Their genealogies were carefully preserved, connecting them to centuries of history, even when states refused to recognize their titles. This cultural continuity allowed them to maintain relevance even in societies that claimed to have left aristocracy behind. The adaptability of noble families during the 19th and 20th centuries reinforces the central theme of their endurance. They survived revolutions, nationalism, industrialization, world wars, fascism, and communism, not because they clung to outdated forms, but because they absorbed new realities. They married into industrial wealth, invested in modern economies, served in new governments, and projected cultural authority even when stripped of legal privilege. Their survival demonstrates once again that aristocracy is not defined solely by titles or estates, but by continuity. The ability to preserve identity, resources, and networks across centuries of upheaval. The perception of hidden endurance also persisted. To many, it seemed remarkable that the same families continued to appear in positions of prominence long after the supposed destruction of aristocracy. Their presence in finance, diplomacy, and culture reinforced the sense that they possessed a hidden resilience, a capacity to survive every transformation of the modern world. This perception fed into the continuing mythology of the Black Nobility, portraying them as shadowy survivors whose influence could not be eliminated by revolutions, ideologies, or wars. By the end of the 20th century, the aristocracy had taken on new forms but remained deeply embedded in European life. Their titles might be symbolic, their estates diminished, and their privileges formally abolished, but their continuity was unmistakable. They had transformed themselves into cultural icons, business leaders, and patrons of heritage, ensuring that their presence remained a constant in societies that had declared them obsolete. Their story in the modern political world is one of adaptation, reinvention, and survival, a continuation of strategies that had been honed since the collapse of the Roman Empire. The legacy of the Black Nobility in the present is not a matter of castles and armies, but of continuity, heritage, and influence that has adapted to the structures of modern society. The same families whose names dominated medieval Rome, Renaissance Florence, or the patriciate of Venice still appear in the cultural, financial, and even political life of Europe. Their role is no longer tied to papal armies or monopolies over trade routes, but to softer forms of authority, philanthropy, diplomacy, real estate, international business, and cultural patronage. Yet the essence of their endurance remains unchanged, an ability to survive by embedding themselves in institutions that outlast regimes, ensuring that their names and resources remain relevant even in a world that outwardly claims to have moved beyond aristocracy. One of the most visible aspects of this legacy is cultural. Palaces, villas, and collections assembled over centuries have become museums, foundations, and tourist sites that project the memory of aristocracy into the present. The Borghese Gallery in Rome, filled with masterpieces collected by Cardinal Scipione Borghese, is today one of the world's premier art institutions. The Medici legacy endures in Florence through the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, and countless churches adorned with their commissions. The Colonna Palace remains inhabited by descendants of the family, yet open to the public as a symbol of continuity. These cultural monuments are not relics of the past alone, but living reminders of the endurance of noble families who continue to shape identity and heritage in modern Europe. Beyond culture, the influence of noble families is evident in the realm of finance and business. The transformation from nobility of blood to aristocracy of capital, begun centuries earlier, has ensured that their survival in the present rests on their integration into global markets. Descendants of noble houses sit on boards of banks, corporations, and philanthropic organisations. Their wealth is not always as ostentatious as in the days of Renaissance palaces, but it remains significant, often hidden in trusts, investments, and discrete holdings. The skills of adaptation honed in earlier centuries, shifting from land to finance, from papal patronage to global commerce, continue to serve them in the modern world of capital flows and multinational enterprises. Diplomatic and political influence also persists. While aristocracy no longer rules through titles or feudal privileges, noble names carry weight in international circles. Many descendants of these families serve as ambassadors, diplomats, or advisors in European states, their heritage lending prestige to their roles. Others participate in international organisations, NGOs, and cultural councils, projecting influence through soft power rather than direct authority. Their global networks, cultivated through centuries of marriage alliances and financial connections, still provide leverage in a world where personal ties and reputation remain as valuable as formal office. The papacy too remains a sphere where the Black Nobility continues to play a role. Though the political power of the papal states vanished in the 19th century, the Vatican remains a sovereign entity and a global religious authority. Families traditionally tied to the papacy still maintain ceremonial and social roles in its orbit, their presence reinforcing the continuity of Rome's aristocratic identity. While they no longer command papal armies or control vast estates, they provide a sense of tradition and stability, embodying the centuries-long link between Catholicism and the aristocracy of Rome. The survival of these families in the present has also been aided by their ability to reinvent their public image. No longer cloaked in secrecy or defined by exclusivity alone, many have presented themselves as custodians of heritage, philanthropy, and culture. They sponsor restorations of churches and monuments, establish foundations for the arts, and fund academic research. In doing so, they project an image of benevolence and public service, ensuring that their survival is not perceived as anachronistic, but as valuable to modern society. This strategy reflects the same adaptability that has always defined their endurance, allowing them to turn potential criticism into legitimacy. Yet the perception of hidden power remains. Conspiracy theories about the Black Nobility continue to circulate, portraying them as shadowy figures manipulating global politics, finance, and religion from behind the scenes. These theories often exaggerate or distort historical realities, but they reflect the aura of mystery that still clings to families whose names have endured for centuries. To many, the very fact that the same dynasties persist while regimes rise and fall is evidence of some secret continuity, some hidden mechanism of survival. Whether one sees them as benign custodians of tradition or as shadow rulers pulling strings, the impression of permanence is undeniable. the endurance of noble families into the present also highlights the changing nature of power itself. In the medieval world, authority was visible. Castles, armies and titles proclaimed dominance. In the modern world, power is often invisible, exercised through finance, influence and culture. The Black Nobility embodies this transition, for their survival has always rested on their ability to operate in spheres that are less obvious but more enduring. They remind us that true resilience lies not in overt displays of strength, but in the ability to adapt to the structures that underpin society, whether those structures are papal courts, trade routes, nation-states, or global markets. Their presence in the 21st century is less about direct governance and more about legacy. They are symbols of continuity in a world of constant change, reminders that history is not a series of ruptures, but of adaptations. Their palaces, collections, and names connect the present to the past, weaving a thread of memory that spans a millennium. At the same time, their discrete roles in finance, diplomacy, and culture ensure that they remain relevant, not as rulers in the medieval sense, but as participants in the global elite that defines the modern age. The legacy of the Black Nobility in the present, then, is twofold. On one hand, it is visible in the monuments, museums, and traditions that bear their names. On the other, it is invisible, embedded in networks of capital, influence, and reputation that continue to shape societies subtly but significantly. This dual presence mirrors the very essence of their history, always partly seen, always partly hidden, always enduring. Their influence in the present is not the dominance of feudal lords, but the quiet resilience of families who have survived every transformation of the Western world and remain, as they always have, part of its enduring fabric.